Mike, thanks for coming back on the channel. It's great to see you again.
Very welcome, thank you. Thanks for inviting me back.
So anybody who hasn't seen the first part of this interview should go back and do that now,
They
because
should.
some of what Mike's going to say will make more sense if you've already listened to him talk about the
Not
airplane and his
necessarily.
experiences. Maybe not, we'll see. So Mike, the plan this time around then is to talk a little bit about what it was like to fly the
Yeah.
Tornado. You talked a little bit in the last interview about the top three things you liked about it. You mentioned the automated wing sweep and the TF and sort of the relatively carefree handling of the airplane. And then we'll talk a little bit about culture and what it was like to be in the RAF at that time on a frontline squadron.
Yeah.
And then we'll talk about red flag and then ultimately your experiences in Iraq. So let's start then with what it was like to fly the Tornado.
It was a very pleasant airplane, actually. Bearing in mind, we learnt to fly the Hawk, which was quite an agile machine and very, very simple. I mean, when I went back to instruct at Chiveney, you get in the airplane and it took 2.5 minutes for the AHARS to erect, so you could get your student who was trying to remember his checks, and you could be taxiing 2.5 minutes after you got on the airplane and sort of get some real pressure on him. Okay, oh my God, how do I start? But the Tornado was very, very different. It's a much bigger airplane for a start, a massively more complex machine. I mean, we talked in the last session about the various bits of kit that it had on board in terms of radars and fancy nav kit and other sensors and things. So that's my emails kicking off. Let me so we don't get any more bings going on, depending how popular I am. Yeah, so we had your baby last time. We got my emails this time, but there we go. The airplane itself felt much heavier as well, in that the control forces were much higher. It seemed to me at the time when I first went onto it a little bit unnecessary. Even that I think it was flight. Surely it could be as agile as you want it to be, really. But I think it's based on, I don't know what the Starfighter was like, but the Phantom, something like that. So similar sort of control forces. But it was actually a very straightforward machine to fly, and in particular the head-up display that you looked through had all the information you needed to fly the airplane. That was the prime flying instrument, and obviously you're looking out front, you'd see it anyway. So it kept your head out of the cockpit, but there was always the temptation to look at it too much, because you didn't really. Again, if you got nothing in front of you, you look out the front and you sort of scan beyond. But in this, you look out the front and look, there's nice green writing. I'll read that. So it was in a way a bit of a sort of curse, but actually it was very good in terms of getting you out, having all the information you needed. So the airplane flew very well. As you mentioned before, whatever the wing sweep, the handling characteristics are pretty much the same. It did communicate to you if you were a bit slow and and the wings needed to come forward, it would start wallowing a bit. If you are going a bit fast and the wings need to come back, then it would sort of start buffeting slightly. But it was quite gentle, and again, there were no major vices to it. It was a very draggy machine though, less so the clean version with nothing hanging underneath. By the time we got pylons, pods, tanks, God knows what else underneath it, it made it very draggy, which meant that if you took the power back, it would slow down very quickly. Similarly, if you started, pull the nose up, it would slow down very quickly. That said, the reheats were amazing. I mean, I think 98% of statistics are made up, so I'm just making this one up. But basically, most jet engines in reheat, you have about 70% of the power is in dry power, and then you can perhaps get another 30 or so in reheat, or perhaps 80-20, something of that sort of proportion. In the RB199, it was 50%. So 50%. So effectively, most of the time you're flying on only 50% of the power available. But when you into reheat, you doubled your engine thrust. So the amount of acceleration that you had with that was quite phenomenal, and it really did, sort of push you back in the seat. So that was quite exhilarating, and particularly one of the delivery profiles, weapon delivery profiles that we used was a lofted attack, where basically you race in towards the target, and about 4 miles short of it, you light the burners and you pull up in a 4G pull, and as the nose comes up and passes about sort of 15-20 degrees, the bomb comes off, and then you do this wing over, which is an instrument. It's a procedure on instruments, because people tried to do it looking out the window and ended up crashing. So the whole thing was a procedural, bomb gone, and then you went head down immediately, rolled to 135 degrees bank, keeping on the pull, and then as it came down, you then roll bank off to be at 90 degrees. You nose past the horizon, rolling down to be wings level at 10 degrees nose down, and then you're kind of passing through probably about 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet to then level off and come out. So doing that at night time was quite exciting. But again, that initial bit where you put the heaters in, it really did sort of push you as and you're accelerating up the hill as well. So it's very, very impressive. So the airplane itself was, I think it was pretty benign as well. That it had no great sort of handling characteristics that were going to bite you in the bum. You could pretty much pull it, yank it, do whatever. I did once depart it. In fact, a couple of people had departed it by trying to brake very hard with the air brakes. So the air brakes came out either side of the tail fin. And the critical thing about Tornado is it's very short machine, so it had this massive, great big tail fin. And if you did things to disrupt the flow over the tail fin, then the airplane did lose directional stability fairly quickly. And a couple of people that I was aware of did actually break into the circuit quite aggressively, put the speed brakes out, pull, and the airplane sort of went dunk, flipped the beginning of an auto rotation. My own experience of that was there's a thing called spills. In order to stop people spinning the airplane and departing like that, this thing which was called, I think, Spin Protection and Incident Limitation System, spills, and that was supposed to feed into the fly-by-wire system to stop you from over alphaing it, so from putting too much angle of attack. And in that, it was, I think, relatively successful. But my own experience of it was in a combat mission. We talked about this earlier on. I extended out of the fight, looking back over my shoulder. And when I looked for the opportunity to come back, I pulled hard back. What I hadn't noticed, as I mentioned earlier, is how the nose was going up, the speed was coming back. And when I pulled back, obviously, I over-alphaed the machine. So the first thing I found as I pulled the stick back and back to my right, is the nose went sideways to the left. And but again, at the moment that I centralised everything, it popped straight out again. So there was a sort of heart-stopping moment. Well, oh my God, what have I done? The navigator didn't even notice, actually. His first clue that something's going wrong was when I said, control centralised height, and which reading through all the boldface drill for spin recovery. But the thing came out. So again, I mean, the machine was very, very benign, really. It was difficult to mishandle. If you did a bit, then you just had to let go and it sorted itself out. So it was it was a very, very pleasant airplane to fly, and it was also it was very quiet, which sounds probably a bit silly, but if we took our masks off, we could shout to each other and hear each other. Whereas most, I think, if you try that something like a Phantom, I don't think you'd be. Well, I think there was also a blast screen between the two cockpits, which there wasn't in the Tornado. So. Which all comes down to it being not very tiring. So you could fly long missions in it without being fatigued, just by being discomforted, because again the seat was relatively comfortable. It was quite a large cockpit, so again you weren't cramped up or anything. Instruments were easy to see, controls easy to reach. So and generally speaking, a pretty good air conditioning system as well. So it was a very pleasant environment, and the airplane flew nicely as well. You did ask me at times when I'd been uncomfortable. The only time I can say being petrified in the airplane was actually when we started ultra low flying. So we'd fly around in Germany mostly at 500 feet, but there were big low flying areas at 250 feet, and we've been brought up in the UK where the low flying system was at 250 feet. So you feel quite comfortable flying around at 250 feet above the ground, looking around, looking behind you, all those things that I mentioned to you about being in the Hawk, looking behind you. Still had to do it in the Tornado, to an extent. But once you get down, as you get lower, it gets exponentially more difficult and more terrifying. And I just remember the first time we're out in Canada in Goose Bay, and being sort of coaxed down by, I can't remember if we did. I think it was with a navigator, actually. So he didn't even have a two-sticker, but so it was very trustworthy of them. Talked down to fly at 100 feet, and at 100 feet and 420 knots, you really are motoring. I mean, it really does feel like the world is whistling past at 3 times the speed of sound, and you feel like you're about 6 inches off the top of the tree. So it was actually quite terrifying. Thinking, I just need a slight hiccup and we'll fly into the ground. Again, practice makes perfect, and exposure to that sort of then makes you get to a stage where you're getting comfortable doing it. And then you'll scan from being bolt, like a rabbit in the headlights, looking straight out the front, go, oh God, I hope it don't crash, into being able to look around a bit, and then being able to look around a lot, to then being quite comfortable doing things. But it was quite a sort of culture change from 250 down to 100 feet. So certainly that did cause me some anxiety when I first did it.
You talked about range and the comfort of the aeroplane, and that sort of lending itself well then to going and flying longer missions. But you also talked about drag.
Yeah.
What realistically then was your operational radius? I mean, how far unrefueled could you go and hit something?
Yeah, I mean that's a critical bit is unrefueled. So we generally flew around with two 1,500 litre tanks, and that gave us enough fuel to fly around for an hour and three quarters, maybe possibly 2 hours. So what's that? Well, 420 knots. So roughly speaking, if you're going to go there and back and have a bit of sort of contingency, we're talking about sort of 450 miles, statute miles, 420 nautical miles. So that sort of distance. That's going low with that tank. We could add on another tank, which would give us perhaps a third tank. In fact, one of the operational fits was with a single weapon and a 1,500 litre tank on the other shoulder pile underneath the fuselage, and that would get you to, I mean, from Bruggen, would get you to sort of into Western Poland and back again at low level. The later, after the Gulf War, we started flying with 22 50-litre tanks, which gave you even more fuel. So you'd have just two 2250s, and that would get you. Well, that probably you're probably looking at the ability to fly perhaps 2 hours 15, 2 hours 30 at low level in that kind of fit. High, low, high, depending on how long you spend at height and how you divide it up. I mean, we'd go. One of the sort of night sorties from Bruggen would be out of Bruggen, high level up to 20,000 feet across towards the Northumberland coast, down across TFing, it's a nighttime sortie, across the borders and out to Jerby Range on the Isle of Man, drop a bomb, climb out and return back. So that length of sortie. We'll say, what did that have? I don't know, 15 minutes of low level in a 2.5 hour sortie. So something of that order. But that gives you a rough idea of the reach. As you said, once you start refueling, then it becomes almost infinite, really.
Did you have any affiliation with, or did you do any affiliation work with the F-111s that were at Lakenheath and Upper Heath?
No, we didn't. We didn't have anything to do with them at all. They were in their own little world. And really, the only time we'd see them would be, if they had to be on the range before us or after us, really. So no, we didn't. And in fact, we had very little to do with. Really very little to do with both other NATO forces while we were generally operating. I mean, as I mentioned, I think last time, if you went out to those flying areas, it was full of airplanes, so you'd see people to fight. But in terms of doing combined missions, not that much. And indeed, we didn't really have much to do with Larbrook either, the Larbrook Tornado wing. We had more to do with the Phantom wing at Fildenrath, trying to sort things out, like perhaps them doing a fighter escort against a cap, or them doing a cap with us flying against it, that kind of stuff, than we did with the Larbrook squadrons. We tended not to. And oddly enough, one of the things which was started by I can't remember which station commander it was now, was trying to get the Bruggen wing flying together, because there were 4 squadrons, each of whom was an individual. Although there was a kind of Tornado force standard operation procedure, everybody had kind of nuanced it a slightly different way. And because I'm on this squadron, I'm better than that squadron. Because I'm at Bruggen, I'm better than Larbrook. Because we're in RAF Germany, we're better than Marham, etc. So there was this great reluctance to not invented here thing. If somebody has come up with a tactic, well, they do this at Marham, we don't want to know about that because we're better than them. But it started off, I can't remember which station one it was, started saying, right, what we'll do is we'll put a 4-ship up and we'll have one aircraft from each squadron. And then it later built up into having, right, we'll put up we're going to put an 8-ship with 4 aircraft from 2 squadrons, or 2 from each, or mixing it and matching it somehow. So people did get to be more interoperable and a bit more flexible.
You talked in the last interview a little bit about protecting your wingman's 6 and being able to turn in and fire off an AIM-9 if necessary. And we did talk about the fact it's not really a dogfight. It's not a dogfighter. But I did wonder, you mentioned about the nearly departing control flight as you were sort of pitching back into to the fight. Did you have any sort of sneaky tricks you could play? I mean, I know one of the things that the dogfighting guys are taught is to look for cues around energy state, on the aircraft they're flying, and swept wing fighters can give that away by having the wings all the way forward or all the way back. there are a number of different cues. Did you have any sort of little sneaky tricks that you could pull to try and lull someone into a false sense of security?
Not really in that. The one I think I did mention last time, the sort of the idea that if you got attacked by fighters on the way into a target, you probably just split, and whoever it was would bravely go off and drag the fighter away. But one of the tactics that we did practice a lot was you try and get the fighter behind you, and if you particularly if you're carrying a retard weapon, £1,000 retarded bomb, is that when he got behind you, then dropped a bomb, and of course when that went bang, he'd go straight into all the imagine the clump and muck that throws up. So that was one of the defensive options that was there. If you got to take the fighter away from the other formation and wait till he got behind you and then drop a bomb in his face. And that was a well recognised tactic, sort of NATO wide really. But other than that, no, not really. I mean, certainly in air-to-air combat, when we're doing 1v1s and stuff like that, you might sometimes come in and have the wings all the way back in 67, so the guy thought you were going really fast, even if you weren't. But other than that, no. And because the wing sweep was manual, because I think the Tomcat had auto wing sweep, and I think there was talk of whether it happened or not, I don't know, of the Tornado F3 having wing sweep, automatic wing sweep. The Tornado was all manual, so we generally left it in 45 unless you're manoeuvring hard, and the guy it'd be pretty obvious to the guy that you had your wings for, if you're doing that. So, because if you didn't, you wouldn't be turning very well. So, you can just tell by the rate at which you're turning that you've got the wings forward, but therefore you might be a bit slower. But no, there was nothing really nuanced in that way. We kind of just went in and sort of did our thing.
I think the Saudis had the automatic wing sweep on the F3. I think
that's right.
It's installed on ours, but we turned it off apparently.
Well, I think a bit like the way that sort of automatic systems work, they don't look forward, they look behind. So it gives you the wing sweep that you would have wanted 3 seconds ago, kind of thing. So to an extent, a bit of a chocolate teapot. Although on occasions, and we all did it on occasions of rattling along at 450 knots, thinking, why is the airplane buffeting? Well, you're in 25 wing. Sorry. So it would have stopped that, I suppose.
Speaking of which, am I correct in thinking I read this somewhere recently that there was an idiosyncrasy in the wing sweep mechanism, which meant that if you pulled the handle back, the wing sweep handle back to sweep the wings further back, but then you decided actually you wanted it where it was, the wings would have to cycle to the back position before they would come back to the 45-degree position. Do you recollect that?
I don't recollect that at all, no. I mean, I imagine they might have decided they needed to go to wherever it was you put the lever first. So if you brought it a bit back and then went, oh dear me, from 45 to maybe you got about 50 degrees before you changed your mind, they probably would go, hang on, we'll go to 50 first, and then I'll come back to whatever it was you just selected. I don't recall there being any limitation on that. I think we tended to be fairly careful about doing that. In that you've got an awful lot of hydraulic pressure wanging through the system, and if you pull it back and put it straight back up again, who knows what's going to happen. So, but I'm not aware of that. But that may well be my ignorance rather than the actual fact of the matter.
So you talked about the RB199 then.
Yeah.
So I'd like to go back to wing sweep in a minute and talk about what happens when they get stuck.
Oh, yeah, I'll tell you about that.
But before we do that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about RB199.
Yeah.
And obviously you've got an optimized sort of low-level version of the RB199. The ADV has an optimized medium and high altitude RB199. How did the aeroplane perform then at medium and high altitudes? And presumably you did do air-to-air refueling. That was a capability brought into the fleet while you were flying the Tornado.
That's right, yes.
What was that like?
Right, so talk about the engines first. As you said, whatever the F3 had was optimised for medium levels. But what you must remember is the whole engine was optimised for low level. It's designed as a low-level cruise engine. So it's designed to take you at 420 knots for, as I mentioned, an hour and a bit eastwards, and then come back again somewhat lighter. So the engine was very, very good at low level. It was very economical. I think trying to think what the fuel burn was, but it was almost. I mean, it was about twice what a Hawk. So I think the Hawk burnt 35, and it was something like 70 or 80 kgs a minute burn, which, when you think about it, is the amount of the thrust that's coming out of it and what it's pushing along was pretty good. So those are the sort of figures of fuel burn, and it was very responsive at low level, and it was fantastic. Once you were climbing out, and we used to climb, I think about 295 knots or something like that, 275 even, I think it was, in normal fit. But once you were climbing that and you pulled the nose up, once you got through 5,000 feet, the whole thing just went. It was, it kind of died. And what does it handle like at 20,000 feet? Well, a sack of spuds, really. I mean, it was designed at low level. The airplane, the wing was designed at low level. The engine was designed at level. So you've got an engine that's performing not at its best. You've got a wing that's performing not at its best. You've got a very draggy airplane. So really not ideal. I mean, that's me being very fussy. If you think that probably most of the last 20 odd years of its service, perhaps more than that, last 20 odd years of its service was flown at medium level operationally. So, it didn't mean you couldn't do it, but it did mean the airplane didn't handle them quite the way that one might be used to if one was used to flashing around at low level in Germany or whatever. So it was not an inspiring machine at medium levels. And again, you had to be, you couldn't whack. Well, you could whack on loads of bank, but that would be followed by a fairly major drop in altitude. There's some videos. There was a video that we took, or one of the guys took on our detachment out of Dhahran, and you see this airplane go along, and it sort of goes whacks like that, and then you sort of see it as it plummets earthwards, much like a Stuka. So, but as I say, we did do air-to-air combat. We did turn it upside down, all those things. But we just have to be fairly careful, and or act with huge amounts of power onto it to overcome the drag. So if you're manoeuvring it in air-to-air combat, you need the reheats, and pretty much if you were manoeuvring hard.
So that then does beg the question: how was it on the tanker then?
It was difficult actually. The tanking was. Yeah, I was going to say that I mentioned being scared stiff the first time I did operational, flying down 100 feet, and I remember being scared stiff the first time I went to the tanker as well, because you spend all your time learning close formation, trying not to hit the other airplane, and suddenly now into the thing where you've got to try and hit it, which is really sort of goes against the grain. And again, there was an art to it, and it was a bit like it was very much like riding a bike actually, in that the first few times you do it, you think this is impossible. How on earth can anybody do this? Because it's if you sit on a bike and and you think how does this work? And suddenly something happens, and click, and you can do it. And then you can't remember how you couldn't do it. And then when you have a break and you come back to it, you go, oh yeah, you do something like this, and it works. So yeah, that was. It was fascinating learning it, particularly learning that new skill, because we didn't do it in Germany. We didn't need to, because all our targets were at low levels, as we discussed. There was no requirement for us to do it, so we didn't do it. Suddenly, when the Gulf came along, or in my case, after the Gulf had come along, there was a need, and so everybody was then qualified in air-to-air refueling. So for me, I've flown the airplane 5 years, come back to it, and then had to learn how to do this rather bizarre thing, which again gave you, because it's pure piloting skill really and luck, it gave you a real sense of satisfaction when you could do it. When you slipped in behind the tanker and popped to see the green light coming, think, thank much, dude, that's me, I'm the boy. I remember doing it actually on TriStar. It was a dreadful tanker. It was awful. It was a massive, great big hose used to swing around all over the shop. And I remember watching and I tried to learn on that actually, which is why another reason I found it very difficult, I think. But my mate was having a go, and eventually I was getting impatient, as you do. I thought, hey, out of the way, my turn. So I just slotted in behind the tanker, plonked straight in. And the next thing was a call from the tanker captain saying, "You are not cleared to join. Leave immediately. Go home." Oh, sorry. So I snuck off with my tail between my legs.
Wow.
Serves you, I've been cocky, doesn't it?
So for anybody who's not familiar with that, so it's a hose and probe method rather than the sort of more, well, it's not more common, but perhaps the better known American system of
American system. Well, the American Air Force system, because of course the US Navy and US Marine Corps both use probe and drogue. The peculiar thing about the Tornado was that the probe came out from, so it sat sort of next to when it's retracted to the right of the front cockpit, but it extended out and back. So the probe was actually, 4 feet out to your right, just outside your peripheral vision. So you had to approach this basket, and the basket came towards you. As it got close to the airplane, to the Tornado, it got the sort of bow wave off the canopy, so it would then fly up and out. So you had to sort of time it such that it flew up and out at the same time as your probe. You had to kind of offset it for this thing that you couldn't see happening. So you had to. It was a certain amount of guesswork initially, but again, as you got used to it, you kind of knew how much to, where to put it, and then drive in, and the thing would just go dunk straight on.
Most people would probably have seen the videos of those baskets breaking off with the on the probe. What causes that?
If you the two sort of ideally you come in at about, I don't know, it's about 3 or 4 knots impact, which then, because in the centre of the probe there are locking jaws, sorry, in the centre of the basket, so the sort of vanes are there really to stabilise the basket is there to stabilise at the end of the hose. They also act slightly as guidance, but then they're not strong. They're sort of thin strips of aluminium, so I don't know about that this sort of size, and they're just designed to make the like a shuttlecock really. In fact, exactly like a shuttlecock, so the middle bit flies through the air. So if you hit it at about 4 miles an hour, you won't break the you won't break those those struts. And if you bounce off them, they'll just click you into, and you'll still have enough to go clank, and then the locking mechanism will lock you in. So then you've got the hose is now locked onto your probe. If you don't go hard enough, if you're going slower than that, then you'll just hit and you'll just bounce out of the probe because the locking jaws won't match. But if you go faster than that, then if you do contact one of those struts, your probe will just go straight through them. So that they'll just bend out of the way, and you'll end up. So you now got your shuttlecock with your probe sort of like a fist going through it. And of course, when you try and come back, it just pulls it off. The whole thing comes off because there's a frangible end on the hose to make sure that you don't break. I mean, that said, there are frangible ends at both ends, so either end might break. So you might end up losing the end of your probe, which is if it's jammed in, or you might just break the basket off. So that's basically what that is actually hitting the thing too fast and or off centre.
You can also, I've seen, sort of send a ripple up the hose that then comes back and sort of whiplashes.
Well, that's right. Yes, yeah, it does indeed. And you end up with the ripple. So if you see it coming, to come back quickly to try and strengthen, lengthen the hose out before it ripples. And I think that was one of the things that tend to take. I think the spokes thing would quite possibly take the basket off, whereas the ripple would probably take the end of your probe off. But of course, if you did the other thing, of course, if you spoked, then one of those the word's gone from me, but the little bits of metal might actually end up breaking off and going down your engine. So that was because again the probe sat right in front of or just above the engine intake. But just going back on, actually, we talked about the engine and how much oomph it had. So you plug into the tanker in dry power. As you filled up, the airplane would get heavier and start sort of sinking and getting more draggy. Of course, the tanker carried on because it's getting lighter anyway by a bit, but it had so much excess thrust because it was designed to be there. And so what you got to the stage where you started backing out of the pod, because the other thing you had to, once you'd made contact, you then had to drive the hose in. There was a marker, and once you drove the marker back into the pod again, then fuel would flow, and as you came back out again, it would stop. So you suddenly see the hose coming out again, and you've got full power on, so you know that you're running out of power. So the next thing is you have to go into reheat. So you're then now going into, I think it was on the left engine it's the right engine because the drag was on the right. So you go into min reheat on the right engine. Of course, that would light up and push you forwards quite quickly. So you have to come back to almost idle in the left and then back up again before it's. So you then juggle it. So then you've got the right engine in min reheat, burning fuel like it's going out of fashion, and you're keeping in with the left and hoping that there's more fuel coming down the hose than is going out the back of the airplane and through the right hand burner. So
did you know that? I mean, would you? Because I don't know about the Tornado, but are there fuel burn and fuel quantity gauges in the back seat? Would the nav be telling you what was going on in that respect?
He could look over actually and see see what was there. But again, he had a totalizer, so he'd see from the totalizer that things were going up really.
So if it was going up, then it was good.
Basically, yes, yeah.
Was there general irreverence coming from the back seat during all of this? Would you get some sort of snarky, but well-intentioned comments about your flying?
Yes, yeah. In fact, that was all the time anyway. But yeah, particularly tanking. Yeah, there would be rude comments, and again, if you did it well, they might even say, "No, that's all right." Yeah, I suppose that's all right. Yeah, lucky day today, is it?
What was it like doing that at night?
In a way, it was a bit easier because there was less to distract you. The airplane, the underside of the tanker was lit up relatively brightly, so you had this sort of lit underside, but you didn't see the rest of it. Which, again, seeing a great big tailplane towering over you, in the case of a Victor or big engine pods on a VC-10, would be quite sort of quite intimidating. And then the pod itself had the light system on it and was dimly lit, so you could see the traffic light system, which cleared you on, told you that fuel was flowing, all that kind of stuff. And then there was a ring of little lights all the way around the basket, so you'd see this sort of you could make out the underside of the wing of the tanker. Then you could see where the pod was with the sort of traffic light system, and then you'd see this sort of faint circular sort of shape just sort of floating around in front of it like that, and that's you sort of line up, and then you went. And again, it was in many ways more straightforward because for that reason. I mean, also I don't know, it's a massive overgenerality here, but at night time sometimes it's sort of calmer wind conditions, less turbulence, so easier.
Easier to get spatially disoriented?
No, easier to get into the. I mean, things bouncing up and down.
No, but I mean, was it easier to? Sorry, I put that as though I was asking. Yeah, no. Well, I meant, was it easier to get spatial disorientation at night than on the tanker? Because presumably, if you went through weather, that would become a possibility.
Yeah. Well, again, in many ways, you've got this reference which doesn't change. I mean, okay, if you go through weather, it moves up and down, or a bit of cloud comes in between. But basically, your reference is solely the bit of the underside of the tanker you can see, the pod, and once you're connected, you can't even see the lights of the basket. So that's all there. So it's just you're literally just flying formation on this bit that you can see. So almost anything can happen. I mean, I think there's certainly an opportunity to get disorientated. You come off the tanker from this very sort of straightforward, lights and everything, proportioned and where it should be, as you come and then turn into complete darkness, or maybe lights on the ground and the overcast above, so it looks like you've got stars beneath you, and it's and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, great opportunity to get disorientated. But while you're on the tanker itself, no, not really. I think it was really sort of naturally reasonably straightforward.
We are. I have in my mind talk about wingsweep again, so I'm not forgetting about it. I'm coming back to. I'm just going the long way around, and just sort of going with the questions as they come into my mind. But of course, we're talking about the night, sort of operating at night. The Tornado had an all-weather, any time of day capability, but you had no until the GR4 came along. I think there was no infrared or FLIR system to project an image into your heads-up display.
Nothing at all. No.
Were you using night vision goggles at the time?
No, I didn't. I think probably in the mid '90s. So from I think probably. I mean, I last flew the airplane in '94, so I think '95, '96. Some goggles were brought in, I think. But no, we didn't use them at all. It's all our non-visual stuff was radar. So going to, to go to the tanker, you might fly a sort of night, you couldn't fly close formation at night because the lights weren't good enough. But you could fly sort of tactical formation. So you fly a sort of loose tactical formation on out to the tanker. The tanker you get to either through radar control, GTI control, or by the navigator using his mapping radar. Sort of abusing it as a sort of air-to-air pulse radar, so he could talk you down. We also had an air-to-air TACAN, so the idea was that the two, you and the tanker, would fly towards each other, and at a range, and I can't remember what it was now, it's around 16 miles, the tanker would start a left-hand turn, and then the idea was that in that, the time that it took for it to complete that turn was the time that it took you to cover that ground. So basically what should happen is at the right range that it counted down, which we got from air-to-air TACAN, the tanker would turn and you'd carry on, and then you'd end up sort of almost beneath it, and then it's just a matter of joining up on the wing, and then once you joined on the wing, then we're into lights and everything, and then visually moving into tank and then coming off. And then if we're going to go low level at that stage, we probably maybe start off in a tactical formation, but then, as I mentioned last time we spoke, we each had our own route, so you then both split as you flew out to your own, the start point for your own route, and your buddy would do the same thing. I mean, his route would be 2 miles abreast yours, but that's where and then you'd fly the route on the radar using the terrain following radar.
So what was it like? What was it like operating the aeroplane then at low level? You said the first time you did that sort of pop-up recovery, it's quite interesting doing that at night. But generally, what was it like flying in an environment where you really couldn't see anything? Because I remember reading in your book, and I don't know if it's the one you got behind you, the Tornado over Tigris, which is a fantastic book. I mean, seriously, anyone listening to this, if they want to read two really, really good books on what it's like to be a fast jet pilot and flying the Tornado, then those are two great books to read. That's a sincere recommendation. But in one of them, I think you say, you're flying at night, and I think you said you turn down the lighting on the instruments because there's less for you to do, or there's not so much focus on the instruments.
Well, that's right. The focus at night time when you're either in the medium level transit, yes, you don't really need to see an awful lot. Really, so you just turn everything down. You've got as long as the HUD, you can see that you've got all the instruments you need there. Just need to be able to look in occasionally, check the engine instruments and the fuel that the fuel's feeding. But other than that, really, there's no particular need to look in. So yeah, you try and turn the lights down. The problem with the Tornado was that the lights weren't particularly good. So you could, if the HUD could be turned down low enough at night time, it meant that it probably only turned up to full brightness. It wasn't bright enough for daytime. So there's a bit of a trade-off. and I remember flying one when I mentioned the bigger tanks which were introduced after the Gulf War for us, the 2250 tanks. They were so big that you couldn't sweep the wings all the way back. So there was another detent at 63 degrees, I think it was. So 63 degree, there was a push button, I think, which could toggle you between stopping the wings at 63, but that was a really bright light that hadn't been done. So I remember turning all the lights down. There's this massive, like a searchlight coming out. I think I had to cut off a bit, pull a bit of paper and cut it and put it on top of it. So, but when you're at low level, your interests again were a little bit more in you were looking at the HUD mainly, but as I mentioned last time, looking at the E-scope. So your scans going from the E-scope, or let's say from the HUD to the E-scope to the HUD to the terrain following radar control. That was when I started flying. It was down here, so you'd be looking down, and you're looking to check that I think there were, I can't remember, 3 green. No, you had to have the autopilot engaged. I can't remember if the light was down there, but you needed the TFR on, and something else. So there were 3 lights you had to check. Later they moved the. So in the sort of late 80s, they moved the terrain following radar controls to just up by just next to the HUD on the coaming. So you just had to look across. So you're looking HUD across and then down, sort of in this sort of triangular or sort of tick type scan. And really, again, apart from wanting to look every now and then, just check the engine instruments are okay, and critically the fuel was feeding. You didn't really have much need to look into anything else really. So it really was kind of at night. It was heads out, even though you couldn't probably see an awful lot in terms of where other airplanes were.
Let's talk about wing sweep then. So
yeah,
you got up to 67 degrees of sweep. What happens when they won't come back forwards again?
Well, let me tell you a story. Yeah, well, I didn't. One of the things that we used to do on our instrument approaches and instrument rating. And so we had to do, I think, about 3 or 4 every year or every 6 months. And when we did our annual instrument rating, we also had to do one then, was a swept wing approach. And we used to do it at 67 wing. And so you flew around the pattern faster than normal. So normally you fly around, for a normal approach, you fly around the pattern about 250 knots. And then on the base leg, you'd start slowing down. So you'd get to about sort of 210 knots, I suppose, at the top of the drop, and then you come down the slope at about 180 knots, something like that, in 25 wing with full flap. One thing we haven't spoken about is flaps. There were, once you moved the wing out of 25 wing, there was no flap at the back of the wing. There were slats between full slat at 25 wing. Once you came back, there was a maneuver position which went to 45, and then you couldn't use it. So if your wings are stuck back, then you're probably going to fly with no flaps. So the speeds need to be higher. So the pattern's at 300 knots, and you come steaming in at 300 knots. I think you got the gear leering, I suppose, 235. So you had to get down to about 230 odd knots on the base as you came around, so that at the top of the descent you pop the gear down. So, and in terms of speeds, you actually flew on Anglo Attack Alpha, and I think for 67 wing, you flew at 16 or 17 alpha. So the nose is actually quite high. So it's like a delta wing. You're flying with the nose quite high, You've just got yourself down below 230 knots, so you can pop the gear down. So you now got the gear down and nothing else, and you're going rattling down with an approach speed somewhere about 215 or 220 knots, so really quite fast. And you do that, and at 200 feet, you then initiate a go around. So reheat, climb away, gear up, and then, okay, good enough, wings forward, and you've practiced it, tick in the box, go off and do the next exercise. So it was something that we practiced quite a lot in each year. So let's say we've done the 4, so that's 5 that you've done in the year. So it's fairly straightforward. So my particular experience was going over to the area just north of Newcastle, around Northumberland. We were using that quite a lot. This was so we're talking into the early 90s now. Low flying in Germany. We go low flying in the UK. We tend to do high to low. So we'll go high level, drop down near Amble or something like that, pop in, we'll do some low flying around, and then we'll go into, we had ground crew based at Lucas in Scotland. So we'd fly a route, we'd probably end up at Lucas, have lunch, and then do reverse, a low level, and then back. And this particular one was, I think it was a pair. We're going off, and I was the number 3. I was going off to bounce them. So I go off with my mate Cookie, who I've flown with on my first tour, my third tour, and so we're on our 4th tour together. We're mates, so he's still good mates of mine now. And we're having a bit of a hoot. We're off we go, and we're waiting for the pair to come into low level. We're down sort of past Amble or somewhere in Northumberland, and we're scooting on. What we're going to do is we're going to go on low level, sneaking along, looking over the hills so that they can't see us. And as they come past, we're going to pop out of the hills, sort of in this sort of massive climb, big wing over, zap down, and give them what for. So this is all planned, and lo and behold, Cookie calls down time. I look out and I see these 2 trails of smoke coming towards us. And excellent, these are the boys. And we pull up, and they see us, which is the idea of it. Really, it's a training thing. So we want them to see us and react, and they react. And the next thing I see is I've gone into reheat. I'm pulling, and they're still disappearing off. I think this is a bit strange. And the airplane's sort of wallowing around, and Cookie shouts at me, "Wings!" And I mean, yeah, I know, I've got them, and I've got the lever all the way fully forward. So show it forward again and make sure maneuver flaps down, which are on the throttle. But the thing's still wallowing around, and Cookie still shouts at me, "Wings!" I thought, what on earth are you on about? And I said, I've got them. They're in 25. He said, "Have you looked out the window?" Of course, I look, because behind me, and I can see the wings are actually stuck back at 45 where we'd lost them. So we're now quite slow, wallowing around with these things in 45. So it's apparent. So I pull the lever back to 45, I'll push it forward again, nothing happens, they're stuck. So I say, right, why don't we we're not on head, obviously, tell the team that we're going home, and why don't we just go back to Germany? To which Cookie said, well, it's probably a hydraulic problem, so perhaps you don't want to do that. There's hydraulic fluids and peeing all over the airplane, it'll catch fire. So why don't we go somewhere else? Hint, hint. So I said, okay, let's do that. And we'll go into Leeming. So, and it's one of those days where it's a lovely, beautiful, clear day, and much like today is at the moment, actually. And so we've got all this fuel on board. We've got 2250 tanks pretty much full, because I can't remember if we haven't tanked, but we used a bit. So coming over, we've been conserving our fuel so we could burn it all off at low level. So in order to get a reasonable approach speed, because the approach speed is dependent on the weight of the airplane, we have to get rid of several tons of fuel. So we cruise around the Yorkshire Dales, pumping out fuel all over them. I mean, it evaporates, so it never actually reaches them. This is quite spectacular. It's a great sort of white plume coming out the back of the airplane. And then we start our way in with the wings fully back. Not fully back, sorry, in 45, so swept back. So again, I've normally done it in 67 wing, 45 wing. Well, that's a little bit easier because it's not swept all the way back, so things are a bit more responsive. And the speed's not quite as high. I think instead of 215, 220, we're looking at about sort of 205, 210 knot approach speed. But even so, if you think we normally land at 160, that's 45 knots faster, and you're touching down at over 200 miles an hour, which would be quite fast. So we start down the slope, and I've practiced it that many times. It's a piece of old ease, actually. You get the thing in the groove, you put the alpha on. I can't remember, it's about 15 alpha it had to be, so it's locked at 15 alpha, going down nicely. But the thing is that every time I've done it, I've always at 200 feet gone around. So I get to 200 feet, and up to now, I haven't really, it's been very low arousal because I know what I'm doing, and I've done it that many times, and I think, yeah, no problem at all. And suddenly at 199 feet, I think, I've never done this before. and of course that's when it all gets really exciting, because the things that you haven't thought of. Firstly, what's the touching attitude going to look like? If I flare, what's going to happen? Are we going to go bouncing? Are we going to get airborne again? How are we going to stop? If we're going to need the hook, where do I drop the hook? Do I drop the hook at the beginning? Or if I do that, it drags along the runway, then it'll probably be worn out. If I use reverse thrust, which I want to use to kill some of the speed, but if I drop the hook with reverse thrust, is that going to make the hook sort of deflect one or the other, and actually perhaps so it may not work? All these things, which suddenly in the last sort of few seconds of flight, we suddenly have to very quickly have a discussion about. And yeah, I touched down quite gently, so we did actually. I think we skipped a bit, so we're kind of now halfway down the runway, still doing 200 plus knots, hurtling down. Quick bit of reverse thrust, and of course the next thing is I'm so busy doing that thought of putting the hook down hasn't. So Cookie shouted at me, hook. Of course, yeah, cancel the reverse, hit the hook, and then we go over the cable at the far end, and of course then sort of brought up to a fairly close, a stop fairly quickly, fairly abruptly, and then the airplane starts going backwards as it comes to halt, and it's all very, very exciting in that last bit, because it's those bits that you, bits you practice, whatever the emergency, however dire it is. If you practiced it, it actually becomes a drill. It becomes straightforward. You're quite comfortable. But the bit that you're not comfortable with every time is the bit you haven't practiced, you haven't thought of, and I guess that's why I think that's why we were very good in general on sort of operations and things, because we practiced most things. The Air Force used to practice and practice and practice, and anybody who thinks you can't do that, and I do worry these days. So we're going off piste here, but where people are saying, do things in the simulator and most of it, it's not the same, and you do have to fly a lot, you do have to practice a lot in order to be competent, both in flying the airplane and particularly in fighting the airplane as well. But yeah, that's wing sweep. Big eyes when you hit the ground at 200 miles an hour and you're going hurtling on one runway. Thinking, how am I going to stop?
Did that result in any of the sort of guidance or the books being, the pilot's notes or whatever you call them in the RAF being updated?
Not that I'm aware of. In that I did write an account of it for there was Air Clues was the, I think it still is, it's an RAF magazine with sort of flight safety thing. People could write there. I learned about flying from that stories, how they embarrassed themselves, half killed themselves, or learnt something, or learnt something in both those cases, and or just learnt something. But I think it's and again, this is another kind of off-piece moment. Really is one of the things was that we, in the crew room, people sat down and had a cup of coffee, or in the bar, people went to and had a beer and chatted about flying. And you never guess what happened to me today, type things. And that's how stories got around and how people learnt a lot of things. So I wouldn't quite say folklore, but you can write stuff down, but really until you've heard someone with sort of big wide eyes and a sort of pale face and shaking hand with a beer or a mug of tea in his hand, that's that's really when things register. And I think that if we, again, in the Air Force of today, if people can't sit around a crew room and talk about flying, or can't go to the bar and share their experiences, then I think that an awful lot is lost. But no, I don't think anything was particularly added, and probably because perhaps people kind of more intelligent than I kind of knew that or thought about it a bit or whatever.
Well, I was going to ask about, when you were talking about doing the practice approaches, I was going to ask whether you were anticipating hot breaks or anything like that. So I guess, it sounds like maybe the documents that would typically talk you through the process, I mean, did they cover those things? Was it the case that actually it was documented, but you had never practiced it or read those documents, or was it the case that they just weren't documented because people thought them?
I think they're probably. I mean, you mentioned hot breaks. I mean, one of the things that the Tornado was pretty good at was stopping. In that you had reverse thrust, which most fast jet airplanes didn't have. It also had a hook as well, and again, that's the last resort, was to use that to stop. So the brakes weren't desperately effective. Although I think they're more effective than some airplanes. But I don't recall ever having a problem with hot brakes. And in fact, I think only a couple of people that I was aware of did, and they were both flying instructors who should have known better, really. And I don't know what they were doing to do that, but I wasn't aware of having a problem with hot brakes. And again, stopping the airplane. If you used the facilities available to you, and on one occasion I didn't, and I did go off the end of the runway. But there was also, apart from a cable across the end of the runway you can attach to the hook, there's also a barrier that would come up, and you could go into that. So I mean, those are sort of different ways of stopping an airplane. So yeah, I think it was just thought that you would use one of those ways of stopping an airplane in an emergency. I mean, there were other reasons to use cables and barriers and things. If you had nose or steering failure, which happened a fair amount, So it wasn't entirely unheard of to do that. So again, I think the assumption was that you would land and you would avail yourself of whatever facilities were there. There probably was a note somewhere in the flying manual saying, these are things that, these things you need to think about, but then probably wouldn't have said more, because again, you don't know. I mean, if I was landing at 200 plus knots on a day with not much wind, but if I'd been landing into a 40 knot headwind, it probably would have been a bit of a non-event, really. So it depends on the day, it depends on the conditions, really.
This is a bit of an odd question, but was it your book, The Operational History of the Tornado, where you talked about somebody in the crew room sitting down reading a magazine or something, and an instructor came in and said, if you've got time to be reading that, you should be reading the flight manual or whatever, and then he challenges him on the wing sweep limitations at a certain speed with a certain configuration, and he gets it right, and then he quizzes the guy who told him he shouldn't be reading the magazine, and he gets it wrong. Was that your book?
That's not. I don't think that's me, actually. I don't recall that, but
okay.
Yeah, I think we were regarded as being quite professional, and I think it was generally reckoned that people could, as long as you did read around the subject, you would have days off, as it were, reading a magazine. Again, most of the magazines in the crew room were probably sort of flight safety type mags, so you'd probably be reading some accident reports or something. I do remember somebody coming in saying, well, why don't you go into the into the safe area and read some of the secret documents, which I didn't know existed. I said, I didn't know there, so well, come with me, I'll show you. And there was quite, I mean, that was another thing about crew room culture, was there was an awful lot of people, the older hands leading the younger hands on, as it were. So if you don't know something, well, I'll show you, sort of thing. And I think you do need to have space and time to do that, really, the opportunity to for people to the experience to let that seep through, to use it to show other people how things are, not just in the air, but also sort of around and about, how what's available, because it's sort of the things of old Donald Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns, isn't it? If you don't know that these books exist, then how are you ever going to know to look for them? So yeah.
You mentioned sort of 15 minutes ago about not really sort of caring what other wings were doing, not caring really too much what Moran was doing, the not invented here approach to things. As you mentioned in the last interview, I'd spoken to Adam Robinson about his experiences in the Gulf War, and he said they didn't really talk too much to the other wings in regards to what they were doing. They all had slightly different philosophies around when to fly and how to attack a target and so on. Can you talk a little bit about then the culture that was apparent in the crew room at that time? Because you've also mentioned a little bit about, if you can't go to the bar and have a drink, or if you're a non-drinker, that's fine, have a cup of tea, whatever. But if you can't do that, then it's difficult to share that knowledge and pass it on. Do I get the sense that you feel things are changing? You talked last time about your son going through the RAF at the moment. Do you think it's a very different RAF?
Oh yeah, it's almost unrecognisable. My knowledge is both what he tells me, and I compare it to my experiences, but also I'm doing a little bit of flying for one of the experienced flights at the moment, so I do see a bit of what goes on, and it's a very different world. I think that one would argue that things move on, and I'm a dinosaur, which I undoubtedly am, a sort of politically incorrect dinosaur. So my way of doing things, in a very different world that it was, sort of 30, 40 years ago. But I think there are certain things which I kind of alluded to already, really, are really very, very important. And I think that I'm not convinced that today's Air Force has that ethos, shall we say, particularly around a squadron, because I mean a squadron was very much a team. We were herd animals. A squadron wasn't just the aircrew. In fact, it mainly wasn't the aircrew, actually. So I think we had about 45 officers, of which 43, 40, probably about 40 were aircrew. An admin officer, intelligence officer, 2 or 3 engineering officers. The rest were NCO ground crew, of mainly engineers, but some admin, some safety equipment people, and the rest of it. And actually, they were really the squadron, because we used to come in and out, and they'd stay with the squadron. And indeed, they were the ones that they were very much their aeroplanes that they let us play with every now and then. So there was I think it depended on the squadron. Really, I think the squadrons that I was on, there was always a bit of an us and them, which there would be simply because A, well, the jobs are different, and B, the work pattern's different. I.e., if I'm flying an airplane, then an engineer can't be fixing it. And similarly, if he's fixing it, I can't be flying it. So we kind of were always working completely out of phase with each other, just meeting up at the interaction. I.e., where's my airplane? Help me get in it, help me get out. Here's your airplane. Go bye bye. Go fix it. I'm going for a cup of coffee. But nevertheless, there were occasions of where we all got together on detachments and that, and we all we all respected each other professionally, and we didn't live in each other's pockets, but we kind of looked out for each other, as it were. Within the aircrew environment, though, we did very much live in each other's pockets actually, and we were very much herd animals, and it was like a pack of wild dogs or whatever, going around. We were very politically incorrect. It was, I have to say, a culture that revolved around drinking too much beer at weekends, and a culture that involved around flying hard and debriefing hard. A culture that where you did take the mickey out of people in quite an uncharitable way quite often, but you gave as good as you got, and you knew that the people who were doing that, taking the mickey out of you, were in that sort of Great British way only doing it only because they liked you, as it were, that they wouldn't take the mickey out of you if they thought you were a prat. So, and again, it was kind of everybody looking out for each other. If you were if the squadron was going to detachment and there was A flight and B flight, then if you were on A flight, you hated B flight. If you were together somewhere, then a different squadron, then A flight and B flight liked each other but hated whatever squadron it was. If we went out somewhere with another squadron and another air force was there, we liked each other and hated the other. It's that kind of thing of expanding. It's a bit like if you're English, you support the England team against Scotland, but if you're English, then you'll support the Lions against the French, and that kind of stuff. We were very much team players. We socialised with each other. We tended to. I mean, it's bizarre for me. I arrived on 14 Squadron out at Bruggen when it was forming, and after 2 years, I was posted to 31 Squadron. And so I arrived. So I had these close friends and socialised all the time with people on 14, and then suddenly, almost overnight, my whole life changed, and I felt a stranger if I went to 14 Squadron. I socialised with the guys from 31 Squadron, and my whole life became around that. And so those sort of allegiances, worked that way. But the result was, of course, that whenever you went away on a detachment, or if you went, if you flew together, you kind of knew each other really well, and you knew what people were good at, what they were not so good at, and you would try and anticipate their needs, one way or the other. And they would do the same for you. So the result was that you had a team that worked together very, very well. Particularly if they're well led as well. So yeah, it was great. I mean, it was all male. It was that kind of dog eat dog environment. So it's quite macho in many respects. But it was not a non-caring environment. It was a great place to be. As a young guy, it was brilliant. It was good fun. And very rewarding, professionally rewarding, as well as being a great environment.
What sense do you get then of things that have changed then? So you're in the interactions you have had, and presumably the network of contacts you maintain.
One of the, I think that, one of the things that, particularly in the Cold War, was we were very, very focused. We knew exactly what we were doing. We mentioned last time we spoke about the nuclear operations. We spoke about the conventional anti-airfield operations. We talked about all the exercise that went on. We knew exactly what we were there for. We knew there was a massive sense of purpose. And there was a whole Bruggen, 4 squadrons of Tornadoes. In RAF Germany, 8 squadrons of Tornadoes, 2 of Harriers, 2 of Phantoms. So 2 of helicopter squadrons. This great force that was there with a very, very firm idea of what it was trying to achieve and how it was going to do it. And particularly in Germany, less so in the UK, because we were kind of in a foreign country, we socialised around ourselves. People didn't buy a house. You didn't buy a house in Germany or whatever and commute. So people were there on base. So people were there together. So you had this very sort of massive feeling of belonging, and of a sense of purpose. And I think that certainly the sense of purpose, I'm not sure is there anymore. But I think nobody quite knows what's going on these days in the world. I mean, okay, there've been operations in over Iraq and previously that to Afghanistan, but none of it's in this country. I mean, people even in the 80s were aware of the Cold War, but what, I don't know, it's a bit nebulous really. And what exactly are you trying to achieve? It's not like you're trying to stop the Russian hordes coming over and raping your mum and that kind of stuff, is it? So there's this massive difference. The other difference is that people are, I think, away a lot on the operational side of things, which means you don't have that same sort of at home. You don't get that sense of belonging in the same way. So again, that sense of purpose, sense of belonging, I think isn't there. And because again, people are quite thinly spread on the ground, I suspect that the sitting in the crew room with a cup of coffee and chewing the fat probably doesn't happen as often as it did or it should do. So I think that those are three obvious things that spring to me. The other, I mean, I mentioned that we were an all-male environment pretty much on the aircrew side of it, and that's changed, I think, well, undoubtedly for the better. But on that theme, I think that the Air Force, it strikes me, has become almost an organisation which exists to be diverse, if you know what I mean, rather than an organisation. I think it's true of most of the armed forces, rather than an organisation which exists to use violent force to enable the wishes of the country to occur. That's what I mean. The services are there to unleash violent force upon people in order to get the political will of the country done, whatever that might be. And they're not really there for anything else. But we're drifting a long way now, aren't we? Into
That's okay. No, I mean, I asked this question in quite a few of my interviews, mostly because I'm talking to sort of older people who've left the service and now don't feel constrained in sharing their opinions. So you tend to get a less varnished picture. I mean, I did see recently that the RAF have hired a diversity chief, and I did see somebody once say, the armed forces should reflect the public that they serve, and I feel that that's not true at all. I think the armed forces should reflect the most capable, lethal fighting machine that you can assemble to do your bidding for you when
exactly
you need
that.
them to.
Yeah, and indeed it never has. I think the only time it almost represented the country was probably in the First World War during the conscription in the sort of latter days of the First World War. But I don't think it ever has. Certainly never did previously, and I don't think it really ever has since. But you're right, exactly that. I mean, I think we're all. I mean, the thing about diversity and whatever is that it was kind of very much welcomed. People were seen as individuals within the team, and so that's how diversity, if you like, was celebrated. And everybody, everybody had a unique thing about them, and that's what they're known for or whatever. So I think I undoubtedly feel that the introduction of female aircrew has been a fantastically beneficial thing. Not least because in my experience of flying with female pilots in the airline industry, I think in general women think slightly different in that they are less eager or less prepared to take unnecessary risk, and also they tend to be cooperative rather competitive, whereas although we did cooperate, we were very competitive as well, and you need to rein that in. So I think that's really a fantastic sort of addition to the service. But I think that I think probably all the things that we mentioned are things which really come from the leadership at the top, both politically and in the high echelons of military force or leadership, which is also probably quite political. So I think that's where the question. I mean, on a squadron, people look after each other, whatever, and but I think they do need to have a sense of purpose.
Not entirely connected to the question of diversity and culture at a sort of a unit level. What do you think about the RAF's relevance in the world today? If you think about what it was when you served, in terms of volume, in terms of capability, in terms of role, mission, and you look at it now, again in the same terms, and you think about the growth and the aggressive positioning that China takes, on the world stage, a fairly unapologetic approach it has, and the same to some degree with Russia. How relevant do you think the RAF is today?
It's difficult to say. So when I joined RAF Germany in 1985, as I mentioned, there were 14 fast jet squadrons out there. I don't know if you've got 14 fast jet squadrons at all now, let alone deployed elsewhere. There were 93,000 people in the RAF. I think there's now 35,000 or something. So it's a third of the size in terms of manpower. I'm not sure in terms of size of combat aircraft. I don't know how many they've got now, but it certainly. I mean, when I was there, it certainly had about 450, I think. And yes, it was a powerful force. There again, if in 1985 you'd asked someone who'd been in to ATAF in 1955, 30 years earlier, they would probably say something. Well, of course, it was 200,000, and we had 900 combat aircraft. I suppose the difference is that most of the guys who were that I've spoken to, certainly who were out there in the mid-50s, would agree that the aircraft were not particularly capable, and also that the general attitude was not necessarily particularly professional. So it's a bit like Flying Club, and there were airplanes that were to a penny you could crash left, right, and centre, nobody really cared, and they weren't that capable. So we're using sort of World War II tactics. If you drive us forward to 1985, suddenly we're talking about a very professional air force. We're talking about a very capable one with airplanes, as we've discussed, with a 24-hour day-night low-level attack capability. Similarly, 24-hour day-night intercept capability from the interceptors, the Phantoms and the F3s, Lightnings even at that stage. So, in terms of, although the Air Force had reduced drastically in size between 55 and 85, it was probably much more effective as a fighting force in the 1980s than it had been in the 1950s. If you roll it forward now, it's a question. The numbers have dropped dramatically. Has that drop in numbers been offset by an increase in quality? And even so, is there a number below which it doesn't really matter? I mean, going with Chinese particularly, you look at their tactics for example, in Korea, just on the ground, for example, and the Russians as well, their tank warfare in the Second World War, numbers, quality has quantity has a quality all of its own. And so, if you might have the best airplane in the world that's got, far 8 missiles, but if you've got 50 people coming at you, then guess what? You're going to come second. and that's my worry. I mean, I saw the 2 aircraft carriers out, Prince of Wales and Queen Elizabeth, and if you think so we've got these 2 massive great aircraft carriers, which are only interoperable with the US Marine Corps. Nobody else can operate off them, and we've got 1 squadron of F-35s that can operate off them. And you're thinking, well, if you think that in days of the old Art Royal that had a squadron of Buccaneers, a squadron of Phantoms, and it's Gannets and stuff as well, and helicopters, it doesn't even come close, does it, in terms of capability? And again, the F-35, and I don't know what it will do in terms of range unrefueled, but I mean, if you've got an airplane, well, as was the case with the Harrier, actually, if you've got an airplane that's got well, in fact, not with the case Harrier, because the Harrier, its engine worked both ways. But you've got a Carter lift engine around with you. That's space for fuel, space for weapons gone. You've got this massive aircraft carrier that costs millions and millions of pounds, and you've got to defend it and everything else, and you've got an airplane that can't go very, very far and can't take very much. So I do wonder at its efficiency. And I'm sure Typhoon's a fantastic machine. I'd love to have a go myself, but again, if you haven't got enough of them for what you want to do, in terms of defending the shores of the UK, I think you've probably just about got enough. But if you then say, well, we also want to start operating it somewhere else, and instead of using just as air defence airplanes, we're going to use them as ground take aircraft. So we now swing roll. So we're now trying to do everything. Quality is going to drop. And as I mentioned, the thing about why we were so good in the good old days. One of the reasons that we were good was because we practiced a lot. And so if you practice a lot, you're good at stuff. If you don't practice, you're not as good. No matter how fancy the kit is that you're flying, you need to be in practice. And I think those things, less flying, fewer airplanes, trying to do more in that time, not having access to, talking to your mates in the crew room, all those things lead to a force which I don't know. I see as being largely irrelevant in the big world. I don't see. I'm sure the Americans would be grateful if we went to help them to go and fight the Chinese or whatever, but it'd be like Korea all over again. Sorry, we can't send anybody. We can lend you some pilots, or we'll send you 10 airplanes out of the how many thousand you're going to operate. So in the big picture, I don't think we're not a global player anymore in any stretch of the imagination. I don't believe anyway, and I don't think the Chinese believe that either.
Well, let's talk about something. Let's talk about something.
Oh dear,
more positive.
I'm going to slip my wrist now.
So we said at the beginning that there were sort of two other topics we would discuss. The first was red flag, and the other then would be your experience in Iraq. I think probably most people listening to this know what red flag is, but it might be interesting to hear a little bit about what the workup was from your point of view. Do you just pitch up there, or do you spend a few weeks preparing before you arrive?
Very much the latter. Bearing in mind that we did lots of day-to-day flying, but it was all at 250 feet. A lot of the flying was because people would arrive on a squadron, people would be posted from a squadron, you'd have guys doing combat-ready workups. You've got, as people leave, formation leaders, four-ship leaders. So now you need to have somebody else. Pair leads need to become a four-ship leader to replace him. A pilot who was new last year, who's now been a year, needs to become a pairs leader. So there's continuous upgrades and things going on and practices. You've got occasional exercises where you'll send a few guys off to do army exercises, support those, etc., etc. But what you don't have is the whole squadron together. What you don't have is low flying down at 100 feet, which you have to qualify doing, and certainly initially we were not allowed to do that all the time. Later on in the 90s, we were allowed to do it routinely, just to keep, once you qualified, you kept current by doing it once every 2 months you'd be sent off to go and fly around at 100 feet. I refer back to my earlier conversation about practice. But at the sort of in the 80s, the deal was that if you were going to an exercise in America, then you were allowed to work up to, or work down to 100 feet. And so that would need a syllabus, again, a training syllabus. So what the workup would be 2 weeks before the deployment. Right, everybody needs to qualify at Operation Low Flying. So to do that, you need to go off on your own and get used to it. Then you need to fly as a pair. Then you need to fly as a bounced pair. Then you need to fly as a four-ship. So worked up. So we now worked up to a stage where we're now doing fighter affiliation with 4 aircraft all flying 100 feet. And in order to do that, we need to be where the low flying operational low flying areas are. First time I did it, we were out in Goose Bay. Great low flying, but rubbish because there were no targets, because it is the wilderness out there. There are no airfields, army people, the rest of it. But you can do what you like. The next time I did it, we actually went up to Lucas, operated out of one of the Phantom Squadron sites there, because we could talk direct to the Phantom Squadrons to organise our affiliation with them to practice fighting them, and also most of the Highlands are a low flying area. The border country is also a low flying area down to 100 feet, Spade Adam range, electronic warfare range, so we could practice all those things. So you go off on a really quite demanding sortie, off to do two lots of operational low flying, to go through the electronic warfare range to practice our warfare tactics, through the fighter cap to practice our air-to-air stuff, perhaps a first pass run at one of the ranges in Scotland, or Tain or Rosehearty, and probably a couple of field targets. But we used to have the same army officer called the ground liaison officer, the GLOW. So the GLOW would go out and park his Land Rover somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and we'd have to find him. Or I think one of them had some inflatable tanks, so he'd blow up these. They're going blowing up these inflatable tanks. So we'd practice attacking that. So it was actually a very intensive workup where we weren't distracted by pairs and fours lead workups. We weren't distracted by combat ready workups, because the guys were all qualified leaders. The qualified leaders were there. Everybody was combat ready, and so it literally was doing the workup to get to down to 100 feet and then to go. So in many ways, the workup was better than the actual red flag itself. Because at red flag it was quite regimented. It was a fixed bit of airspace. The weather was generally pretty good, so you were in that airspace or you weren't. Once you got to know it fairly well, I mean, it didn't reflect Western Europe particularly well because it was desert with mountains as opposed to flat with trees. So there are all these sort of those things, and in many ways, as I say, the experience of the workup, people quite often would say, well, actually, the workup was better than the exercise itself, in terms of the professionalism and to an extent fun as well. But yeah.
What impressed you about Red Flag then? What did you come away thinking that was, what all the hype is about?
The whole thing, the whole concept in the first place, I think that you could fly virtual combat missions there, that you saw all the kit, and also the incredible professionalism that was shown by the staff there, and in terms of the staff who ran the exercise, the staff or the pilots who did the red air stuff, the guys who did the ground threats and everything else, were really, incredibly professional about how they did things, and that was the flavour that also brought in. So, I mentioned that before. We tended to operate our own little squadrons and didn't even talk to, didn't talk to the 9th Squadron. Why would you? Despite the fact they were just across the road. But suddenly on Red Flag, you'd be there, and you'd be right. You'd be in a package where suddenly you've got U.S. Air Force, Weasels. You've got perhaps 2 other 8 ships of U.S. Air Force ground attack aircraft. You perhaps got a 4 ship of U.S. Marine Corps ground attack aircraft, and you've all got to work together. You've also got your fighter sweep and all that kind of stuff. And so now, from being quite insular into, right, how does it all work together? How do you do things? How are we going to fit this together? And actually, that when the Gulf War came along, in the experience of the guys there, and certainly when operations after the Gulf War came along, which was my experience, having done all that, really made it very, very easy to then operate with the Americans in these large scale packages that where Cormeo's combined air operations, because you'd seen it and done it, and seen it, and also the great thing about Flag was the debrief. After you flew the mission, everybody came in big amphitheatre. And I talked last time, I think, about the Decimano, the air combat instrumentation range. The same thing was there on this massive scale, covering this sort of airspace the size of most of England and Wales, or central England and Wales, with all the airplanes with pods on, so you could see exactly where they went, what they did, who did what, and it all came together. And so you really could learn the lessons of what you'd done right, what you hadn't done right. And that was the big thing about it. Really was flying it in realistic conditions, but then also having the luxury to be able to look back at it and say, well, how did that? What did we get right? What could we do better?
Do you have any particular memories of particular sorties that you flew? Were there any that really stood out to you?
The ones that stood out usually stood out for the wrong reasons. I can remember. I remember whinging and moaning because one of the flight commanders of 31 thought it'd be a great idea if we did a strafe attack somewhere. So we can't always guns out. Once you start loading guns, the airplanes are pointed in different directions, safe headings, and the rest of it. And I was very anti this and made my thoughts known and thought it was an utter waste of space and blah blah blah. Of course, we set off on this day, and again, we were limited in where we could go, what we could do, what evasion we could do because we had guns, live guns. And I popped up, got on the target, switches live, pulled the trigger, and nothing happened. I couldn't believe it. And what had happened was the electrical connectors had worked themselves loose, and both guns were disconnected electrically, so I couldn't fire the guns. So not only had I whinged and moaned, I then flown this sortie, and nothing of that. Yeah, I mean, other ones where I was going to say they to an extent they all meld into a bit of one, because I think I did about 4 on my first 2 tours. No, I think I did 3, and then I went back and did a 4th one later on. Actually, that 4th was quite interesting because it really so even before the Gulf War. And I think it was Chuck Horner, was running one of the exercises that we did, and he was very anti us being at low level, was desperately trying to get us to go up to medium level for the purpose of this exercise, to which we all turned and said, well, no, we do low level and we're to practice low level, that's what we're going to do. little did people know that they'd be then called upon to do it. But the deal with when I did the last one on my last tour was that it was half day and half night. So the previous ones had been day, so we ended up doing a night flag, which was interesting because you then did, as I mentioned, as you might think, the TF stuff, but also we did a couple of medium level sorties. And I remember that hooting around in this thing. And so you can't see anybody because you haven't got goggles on, and the only way you can know that you're, because there's a route, but people start manoeuvring and things. So the only way to do it is you've got your own height band to stay in. And so we went hurtling off, and we flew this route, not seeing a single other person other than loads of lights sort of flashing around and flares coming off and the rest of it. As we were there jinking, 4G one way, 4G the other way, pumping flares out, and God knows what else, on chaff and God knows what else. There was really not much of a clue as to what had gone on, really. So it was quite an education looking at the debrief afterwards. It was great. It was great fun, but yeah.
Did you have a sort of moment? So one of the things behind the Red Air experience, in particular using actual Russian or Soviet kit, like the Red Eagles did, or I think the Talita Peak electronic combat range does with Soviet systems.
Yes,
where you looked at your RHWR and you saw a 6 on it or an 8 on it, and it sort of did you have that buck fever moment or anything that?
Yeah, very much. I mean, certainly those the SAM systems. Yes, all those things. Yeah, you got locked up by SAM 6. It doesn't often make the heart race, and again, doing all manoeuvring and firing out chaff and trying to put the thing so the CW jammer can go onto it and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean that was the big thing for us was, and as I mentioned previously, we always saw as the big threat of the SAMs. So from that perspective, it was brilliant actually, and particularly trying terrain screening, and you suddenly found that 100 feet. Even the slightest fold in the ground can give you a massive advantage. Something, a 30-foot dip, suddenly now instead of 100 feet above, above the thing that's trying to shoot you, now we're only 70 feet. And so, right at the bottom of or very much beneath where it can actually, lock onto you and that. So it was fantastic for that perspective. Air to air, yes, reasonably so. Not so much in that they could see us quite easily because we were dark painted airplanes against a sandy coloured background, and we're flying so low that the shadow, you could see the shadows. So from that perspective, the guys could sit up at 20,000 feet and see us coming. And but again, our tactics were designed against the Russians in Western Europe, not against F5s in America. So and I think they realised that as well. And again, the professionalism was such that they played they played the game. They played being Russians over Europe for us. I mean, the thing was, the F5 is a very, very difficult airplane to see, but I mean that's what everybody will say to you. For guys who fly, Phantom guys doing it as air to air and everything else. Small airplanes are difficult to see.
So that creates a nice sort of segue then into your Iraq experience, and you as you mentioned, you didn't go to the sort of August through January first Gulf War in 1990, 1991. You were, I think, an instructor at Chivno, weren't you?
That's right. I had a fantastic war. Yeah, flying the Hawk. I really enjoyed it. I was doing this recreational flying and watching it all, drinking beer in Devon and and sitting on the beach watching scantily clad women and all that kind of stuff that you should do. And meanwhile, on the telly, there were all these blokes who were being shot at by Arabs. And I know that part of me felt that I should be there, and probably most of part of them thought that they should be where I am. So, I mean, whilst I, now 30 years on for them, they can all get together and have great reunions and talk about how wonderful they were. And I would feel very uncomfortable to go along to one of those because I wasn't there. Yeah. I think I had a better deal, really. But I did. I mean, one of the things that I did after about the first day or 2 days when they'd lost 3 airplanes at that stage is I rang up the poster, who's a guy that I ended up later. He ended up being my squadron boss later on, and I knew him from the conversion unit. He's one of the guys who helped me get through the Tornado conversion unit. And I said to him, "I'm here. I've only been off. So I've been off 31 squadron for 6 months. I said, if you can get me into a Tornado, I could be combat ready again in a week. And if we run out of people, I'll go out there." And he said, "You're in the queue behind me," he said, "but I don't think we're going to be needed." And indeed we weren't. But no, I mean, there was part of me, as I've mentioned, we were team animals, and I lived with 31 Squadron for 2.5 years. I just left them, and I still kind of felt that I still wore 31 Squadron badge on my flying suit when I was at Chivner. and the guys were off at war, and I felt that I should have been there with them because we were part of the team, and I kind of felt like I was letting them down by not being there. They might be thinking that I was doing them a favour by not being there, but there we go. But that was my thought at the time. I thought, really, I did feel guilty. I did feel bad, and professionally, obviously, having spent 5 years flying the airplane, having been combat ready, I felt that I should be, I'd always expected to do the job that the Queen paid me very good money to do, really, by being there. But it wasn't to be. And as I say, I'm not sad that I didn't go. I just actually thank my lucky stars that I didn't. I was very, very fortunate.
Obviously, from my point of view, I talked to Adam Robinson. He told me about his war, and of course, you've just referenced the fact that the RAF was primed to go in at low level. That was the tactic and the weapons delivery that it wanted to do. And Horner was looking for you guys to go and practice medium level, and of course, that transpired in the end. The low level option was taken off the table. Presumably, the RAF decided that itself. But when you got back to the Tornado, then what changes did you notice then in the way that it was operating, in how it had been, let's say, invested in terms of capabilities, in terms of the addition of a laser-guided bomb capability? Were there real sort of sea changes in the way that the force was operating when you returned to it?
I wouldn't say sea changes, because we did still retain the low-level role, and that's still seen very much as our primary role still, although obviously the Russians had gone home, but we were still... The RAF tactical doctrine was still low-level flying, so we still did that. And again, it's one of those things that's skill to keep, because you don't know when you might need it next. So we still did that, but we started looking at medium-level operations more seriously, and we did start practicing them a bit. And again, from my perspective, it helped that I'd been to Chivno, where obviously we've done quite a lot of air-to-air stuff. So again, I was in the groove for thinking about how we might employ the airplane, tactically air to air, all that kind of stuff, how we defend ourselves, etc. So it was kind of, we'd added that string to our bow rather than taking another one off, as it were. So we were doing more. The other thing was that we'd stopped low flying in Germany, because low flying had been stopped below 1,000 feet, I think it was 1,500 feet. So it was pointless trying to do it. So we would, unless there was nothing else to do, we would generally go high to low into the UK. As I mentioned earlier, we had a turnaround facility at Lucas, so that's what we tended to do. On the way across, medium level, not much else to do. Well, why not put a medium level sort of a simulated attack in there? Pretend that you're doing a laser attack. One of you with a designated pod, one of you with the bombs, because that's, again, we didn't have enough pods to go around, and the airplane, I don't think, was quite capable of self-designating at that stage. Well, it did very later did get the software to be able to do it. So yeah, we did we had changed. We'd moved away from the low level in Germany and fighting the Russians into low level in the UK, not quite sure who we're fighting, and medium level as well. Who knows when you might need it again? Stage of thing. So when I arrived, and I remember actually in the summer, I went off on my summer holidays, and that was when the no-fly zone was established in over southern Iraq. And I remember reading it, thinking, yeah, whatever. I think they'd sent a couple of recce tornadoes out there. We weren't a recce squadron, so I thought, well, there's bad luck then, really. We'll continue doing as we've always done. And then when I came back, things had changed, and they said, right, they've changed their minds now, because the Tornado went out there, but of course the recce Tornado was designed for low. It was designed to fly around at 100 feet and take photographs, not at 20,000 feet and take photographs. So it turned out to be a bit of a chocolate teapot, and so suddenly the thing's open to anybody now. And rather, because there were no recce pods for the Tornado at that stage, the idea was, well, we'll use the laser guidance pods, the tile pods, of which there were 2 in existence, 3 in existence, I think. No, it was 2, and they were both out there in theatre. So you weren't ever going to see one until you got out there to do the job with it. So we did actually do a bit, and I was insistent that we did a workup, actually. The boss had said this, we need to do a workup, and I sort of said, well, we need to do medium level tactics, we need to do some medium level fill with Phantoms, we need to drop bombs from medium level, all these things. So I ensured that we did all that, because I was given the job of sorting the workup. So organised lots of tanking so that we were up to speed on that. I organised went up to Garvey range up on Cape Wrath to drop live bombs. They weren't laser bombs, but they were live freefall, but just go through the motions.
Is that the rock? That rock that's in the middle of the sea?
Yeah, that's right.
Yes,
yeah,
okay.
Yes, huge great rocklets of yes, none the worse word, I don't think. But it's the one place in I think in the UK where you can drop live £1,000 bombs. So we went up there to drop. So we actually dropped live £1,000 bombs. We've done that. We organised a fill with the F3 squadrons, and again from Lucas, and then we'd land, and then they'd debrief us on what they thought of tactics and things, what we had done well, what we hadn't done well. So we did a bit of all that. We carried on doing some low-level stuff just to keep our hand in. Again, you don't know when you might need it, but also it sort of keeps your skills honed, really, if you're used to doing those things. And so when we went out to Iraq, it was basically a sort of reconnaissance job. Well, A, reconnaissance, and B, kind of filling the airspace, really, to make the point to the Iraqis that we could fly it and they couldn't. There were, a better airplane would have been the F3. They should have sent the F3s out there really as fighters to maintain the zone, because we weren't fighters by any stretch of the imagination, and we literally were there to fly, and we were given a whole lot of points of interest to cover, and we'd fly with the tile pods, and we do. I think they're about 3.5 hour, 4 hour sorties. So you'd fly up from Bahrain, Dhahran, near Bahrain, where we're based, up to the tanker, take on fuel over Iraq to the various points of interest. We'd then film them with the tile pod. We'd fly in as a 4-ship, and then over Iraq, sausage side, we'd do into 2 pairs, one with a pod, one without. So we had what we call the tiled airplane, which was the recce airplane, and the other was called the shooter. The idea was that you were there as an escort for the because the tile guy would be heads in, looking at the look at the imagery, trying to find the various points of interest. What neither of you could see was what's underneath you, so you need to be stepped out in battle to see what's beneath you in case somebody fired a rocket at you. And also, of course, because the other crew were so focused on what they're doing, you need someone else to keep the big picture. So, so we'd go off as a 4-ship tank, and then split into 2 pairs, cover the various points of interest, come back, and back into Dhahran again, sort of 4 hours later.
Did you get any trade? Did anyone lock you up? Did anyone come after you?
Not at that stage. One of the things that had been noted was that when the Iraqis started to fly into the no-fly zone when they thought the American fighters weren't there. So as the Americans turned cold or sent one back to the tanker, we're just about to hand over, MiG-25 would come zooming in at Mach 3 and then sort of turn around and go back out again just to make the point. So that had happened, and we also thought that there were some MiG-23s I think involved that we thought were, again, trying to do a similar, take a dash in and then take a pot shot at one of the coalition aircraft in there. So possibly us, even, in the knowledge that we weren't, although we had the sidewinders on board, we didn't have air-to-air radar or anything. So we'd been perhaps relatively easy meat, unable, or probably wouldn't shoot at them first, as it were. So that did start happening, and also it's between December '92 now. Saddam did say he was going to take back the airspace, and they started deploying SAM-2 sites. SAM-3, I think, started appearing underneath the no-fly zone to threaten us. So whether they were real or not, we don't know. We were told these sites were there. In fact, one of the points of interest that we had to cover was a couple of SA3 sort of suspected sites. We were to go over and film that area to see if the photographers could find it. So that's how things started going in at the end of 93, and then I think 27th of December 92, one of these, and I can't remember, I think it was a Foxbat, came in, and actually what had happened was that the Iraqis had spotted that the French Mirages were in there as doing the air-to-air work, and they knew, because they flew Mirage themselves, what the endurance of Mirage was. So they see the guys come in and go, right, they'll be there for another 45 minutes, and then he's going. So at 46 minutes, a Foxbat would come zooming in, and so what happened this day was the Americans got clever, and so I gather, this is a gossip rather than truth, but I gather went in using a French call sign. And of course, the Eagle stays on state for considerably longer. So the Foxbat came in to be met by an Eagle that said, "Thank you very much." In fact, it wasn't; it was an F-16 because it was the first. I think it was one of the first. AMRAAM or AMRAAM, I think, kills.
Yeah. It was an F-16D. Yeah,
that's
first AMRAAM kill.
Yeah. So the guy went in expecting to see the back end of some Mirage and got the front end of an F-16D instead. So that was what sort of started kicking things off, and it slowly got. Tension started ratcheting up, and the Americans decided that it'd be a very clever idea to go in and, various plans came up, of which the most politically sensible one, shall we say, came up from the US Navy. And what their idea was, to, as they put it, to poke out the eyes and ears of the of the air defence system south of the 32nd parallel. So they identified 2 combat operation centres and air defence nodes, and various communication nodes, and I think a couple of SAM sites as well. And so then there was this coalition airstrike against them. And again, it was much like a medium level red flag in many ways. Right, so and so was the package leader. Right, in you go. We're going to put 4 Tornadoes up. So we're now working with the French, with the F-15E guys who are going in at various targets, the F-117 guys who are going to take out the targets, and the F-15C guys who are going to provide the cover, plus the US Navy who are going to send in A6s, F-14s. So again, putting all that together was really quite, in many ways quite straightforward, in that we were quite used to doing that through having operated through that system in red flag. And that was our bit. So we went off on the 13th of Jan in '93, 4 aircraft. Again, we'd used the tiled as a recce fence. We hadn't used it to drop bombs. In fact, I'd never dropped a laser guided bomb. I hadn't even seen a laser guided bomb. So I went out and found them on the aeroplane. Oh, that's interesting. And in fact, no, that's right. It was the 12th of January we went out to the aeroplanes, and literally, it's quite funny because we'd planned it all. We were ready to go. We keyed up to go, and the ground crew were kind of we were quite cagey because we didn't know what they knew or what we could tell them. They didn't really know what they could tell them. They knew we were going somewhere, but they weren't quite sure. And it was all a bit odd, and we were just strapping in, and then we were told it was cancelled. So by which time we kind of already told them, the guys a bit, but anyway, but then it was rescheduled the next day, the 13th of January. So off we went, and it was one of those strange things. Actually, it was probably one of the most boring sorties I've done in my life in many respects, because it was all planned and it did all go pretty much according to the plan. We went out. I'd had a cold the previous week and I hadn't flown, so I went up and we were suddenly into night tanking with these bombs on board, so it was heavier than it had been. And but anyway, it worked. We got filled up, went off. We flew our route. We got slightly, the winds were somewhat different from the plan, so we ended up having to use the reheat to accelerate up to get back on the timeline. And the moment we did that, we then got locked up by a SAM-3. So then we had to go out of reheat and start dropping flares and chaff, and God knows what chaff, actually not flares. But yeah, it was quite an interesting time, really. Afterwards, we discovered it was probably a false alarm, but we didn't know that at the time. But there was lots of sort of heartbeats missed. But actually, then it was a case of dropping the weapons and then coming back pretty much as planned. So, and a successful, pleasingly successful mission as well. We were tasked against a air defence headquarters building, which I was targeted against, my pair, which we took out, and also a radar control building, which the other pair were tasked to take out, which they did as well. So they took that out. So we did very well. We got sort of 100% record of hits. We then did a day light raid 5 days later, so 18th of Jan, and that was against so a similar radar control building. We were operating against a site near Alamara, and there was one that had been up at near An-Najaf, a bit further up and east, and right actually on the border, just very, very close to the 32nd parallel, which I remember being a bit twitched about, because I thought, well, if the Iraqis want to take a pop, they've got the ideal chance, because we're going to be flying along this thing. And we had an F-16 escort. Of course, they were very excited because they thought, yeah, perhaps the Iraqis are going to pop at the Tornadoes, and we can get ourselves a MiG. But that one didn't go quite as well. In that the 2 pods that we had, the only 2 pods in the RAF, were both actually prototypes, and they had different IR sensors, or slightly different, or visual sensors. And one pod was good enough to be able to pick up this tiny little target that was in the middle of nowhere, and the other one, the guy couldn't detect it at all. And we had a look at his film afterwards, and it just felt so hard for the guy, because he was desperately trying to find it and he just couldn't. So that one I didn't drop, but the other team did. But again, we took out the target that we were supposed to take out. So yeah, success there. And on that one, actually, again, we didn't. I think we saw some gun radar, gun radars looking at us, but nothing actually locked us up, and we weren't aware of being fired on.
Did it feel so? Tile, just in case anyone's wondering, that's thermal imaging and laser designation systems. That was the RAF's first homegrown laser designation pod. But did it feel then having talked a lot about that experience of flying at 100 feet, 420 knots, and now going up, flying at medium altitude at night, dropping on something, looking at a sort of fuzzy picture, which presumably you didn't see, but the guy in the back did.
No.
Did it
No,
feel a bit
he
weird?
saw a fuzzy radar picture, and the guy on the other airplane saw a fuzzy picture through his pod. So yeah.
So did you feel like you'd been into combat?
It's a difficult one. It was sort of yes and no, really. I mean, I think we felt that we had done because we'd taken off with some bombs on board and we got rid of them. We'd seen big flashes as they went off, and we'd seen the film afterwards from the pod. So yeah, we felt we'd done that. Well, I think we felt that we had been let off a bit easily because we hadn't been shot at. I mean, again, we thought we had been locked up by a SAM-3, but probably weren't. We discovered later. But yeah, it wasn't quite the excitement that one had expected. And again, when you talk to guys who are out in the Gulf with all the sort of AAA and stuff going on, I mean, what we did see is we went past Talil with what I thought was AAA, but I think it must have been something like that. It's a sort of stream of tracer that came up, but then went out again. So quite what that was, I have no idea. But yeah, we went past it at the same time as the F117 was dropping its weapon. So whether it was something that came off that or not, I don't know. But we saw these sort of streams of like tracer coming up, but then they died off very quickly. Yeah, it was, and again, when we dropped our weapon, we're turning away. You could see sort of flashes going on the ground of probably people, very angry people firing AK-47s that weren't going to reach us up at 20,000 feet, but nevertheless. But you're right. Yeah, it didn't. I don't think it felt in the same way. And again, that's another reason why I'm very careful to distance myself from the guys who were there during the Gulf War, particularly those first few low-level missions, because what they went through was a completely different experience. And I wouldn't wish to feel that I was boasting that I'd done the same, because I haven't. So yeah, it is one of those sort of, I don't know. Yes, to an extent, yes, you had been in combat, but to an extent, aware that we got off very, very lightly indeed.
You said before you started talking about actually going to Iraq, you had mentioned that you put your name forward, and you sort of joked about paying back the Queen for the doing your job for the Queen, and sort of paying back the Air Force, and it being time to sort of pay your dues. But do you feel then, in retrospect, like you validated your capabilities, your prowess as a fighter pilot? I know that's that's one of the things that goes through many people's minds. They want to be able to show they can do what they've been trained to do, whether you're a pilot or a submariner or whatever. Do you feel, looking back, that Southern Watch gave you the opportunity to do that?
Yeah, I think very much so. Exactly that. I think it was the entry level, if you like. I mean, the guys who did the Gulf War obviously did an awful lot more, but yeah, I think that puts me certainly on the first rung of the ziggurat or whatever it was. And yes, it was. And you're right. I mean, it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. It wasn't, because again, we ended up, because of the way things have worked, instead of working as a close knit team, that various people being put in from the UK, and so we ended up with in my pair there was the other airplane was flown by a couple of guys who come out from Marham. In my back seat was a guy from, I was on 14 Squadron at the time, there's a guy whose back seat was a guy from 31 Squadron. So it wasn't as if, I'd expected to go with, four of my close mates, from the same squadron. So it wasn't that. So it was very different from my experience. And it was very different, obviously, from the low level stuff that we trained before. But I think perhaps part of the, if you like, the validation of that training was the fact that we were able to, as four people from three different units, whatever, operating in a way that none of us had been operating together before, and none of us had particularly seen before, that we were able to put it all together. And it was the fact that we did this relentless practice that, of the years before, that meant that we were able to be, flexible enough, really, to do it, and have the capacity and mental agility, or tactical agility, shall we say, to actually switch into something completely different and make that work. I think that was the validation of the whole sort of the Air Force's training and operational ethos, was the fact that it could train you well enough doing something that you could then pick up the reins on something else and do that to a good enough standard. Where
did you go from there then?
I finished my tour on the squadron, and I think did it finish with a red flag? It almost did. I think with that last red flag that I did. And it's funny looking back. Actually, it's quite scary looking back. And I got to the stage where I thought, well, I've flown Tornadoes for this stage 10 years. I've seen it, done it, ticked off most of it. I've dropped bombs now. Do I need to do this anymore? And I was getting to a stage where, we got you on the program doing so, and say, oh no, I've got a bit of paperwork to do today. Give it to so and so, let him do some flying today. And I was being very fussy about what I flew and who I flew with and all that kind of stuff. And I was ready for something else, and I actually ended up being posted to. It was a nightmare. Actually, I got posted to Rhein-Dahlen, which was the headquarters of what had been RAF Germany, had now become 2 Group. I say nightmare because Rhein-Dahlen was a dump, but then you're only there for about 3 months and you go, I wish I was flying a Tornado again. I'd love to go back there, and so I did that, and I did a tour there. That then cut short because the headquarters was disbanded, and I then went to Innsworth, Gloucestershire, which was the training command headquarters at the time, personnel training command. And I worked on the replacement of the Bulldog trainer, which was completely different from anything I'd seen before. Different job, but it was quite interesting. It was one of the public finance initiative, one of the trailblazing projects for that. So I think there was a prison being built somewhere, a hospital being built somewhere, and us getting this aeroplane in. So that was interesting. But yeah, by then I decided I'd had enough, so I left and joined the airlines and became an airline pilot.
Would you change that decision if you had to go back and do it all over again?
No, the decision was probably based on other things. The decision was based on having a young family. I mean, when you're young and single, which I was for most of that time, flying in the Air Force, it's great fun. The fact that it's dangerous doesn't even cross your mind. The fact that the job hasn't been, the program still needs to be written, and it's 5 o'clock. And okay, guys, well, I'll stay on. I'll stay for another couple of hours and do it. I'll see you in the bar at 8 or whatever it's going to be. You can't do that when you've got kids. You can't do that when you can't do it. You've got a wife, or you won't have a wife for much longer. But your kids want to see you. You've got other. There are other more important, pressing issues in your life, really. And so I had a great time. But it was those issues. It was whether I believed in, given that I'd given up my flight, because I had given up my flying at that stage. You start climbing the greasy pole of the career ladder in the Air Force. You're not going to do a lot more flying. You will be sitting headquarters, sort of writing and stuff. And I thought, well, I'd actually just been selected to go to staff college. So I think, well, I've done 18 months at Rhein-Dahlen, 18 months at Innsworth. I was going to spend a year there. I then probably going to spend a year working in a cupboard in MOD. All the hours that God sends on a project that then get cancelled just as I finished that year. And then I might, if I was lucky, might get picked up to maybe going back and command a squadron or something like that. So I wasn't going to fly for ages. I wasn't going to see my kids for ages. We were going to end up moving home sort of 3 or 4 times. It's not worth it, is it really? But no, I wouldn't change it. I had a great time. The Air Force had changed. I'd seen that change. I'd been in it, and I'd enjoyed what I did, and I went away from it sort of with fond memories and without getting bitter and twisted about it. So,
how many hours did you get in total? Do you remember?
Military hours. I now got about 1,800 on the Tornado, about shy of 1,000 on the Hawk. I think I got about 4,500, 5,000 flying hours. I think in the Air Force, something like that. And then I've done another. That was in the space of including all my when I started in '78. So that was in the space of 19 years. And then over the next sort of 19 years, I got about another sort of 15,000. So it shows how how the sort of flying changes depending on civilian and military flying. So.
If it's not a strange question, does it sometimes feel like it was all a bit of a dream that it happened to somebody else? I mean, does the passage of time sort of distance you from the experience, or if somebody sat you in a Tornado tomorrow, do you think you would be right at home quite quickly?
Yes and no, in a way that it's kind of almost sort of becomes subliminally written on your brain. I think all those sort of things that as a young man that you did. You're right. It does feel like it happened to somebody else, but every so often little bits come back where I go, yeah, I remember that, and dear old Cookie and I will talk about the wingswept thing over a beer sometime. 30 years later. So that kind of thing does go on with little bits come sparking back. I found writing the book when I did that to be very therapeutic, and and again it brought memories back. But yeah, I did actually. I have sat in a Tornado cockpit a couple of times, and last time or the time before that, I remember sitting in it and having been used to an airliner cockpit for however many years at that stage. for 20 years. No, it wasn't there. It was probably about 10 years. I sat in this thing and I couldn't believe how small it was. It's tiny. I remember thinking the tiny was being quite. But yes, I did remember where things were and the general pattern of things. I probably could have a bit thought of started it up. And I guess once you get airborne, it probably would be like riding a bike, come back to you. Remember how to do it. I'd love to have a go, but
did you miss it? I mean, going from that kind of flying to airline flying.
Well, yes and no. I mean, it was. I mean, flying a fast jet airplane is exponentially more fun than flying an airliner. It's actually the control of the airplane is easier because you've got a stick and you pull back, and the cows immediately get smaller, and it rolls, and you can do what you like with it, pretty much carefree. In an airliner, you're pretty much always flying it through the flight director system, so and a lot of stuff's done on the autopilot rather than. And in fact, I got to a stage where I used to enjoy flying more using the autopilot than hand flying it, because the autopilot doesn't look. It's like the driver who comes to a roundabout, stops, put the handbrake on. Look, there's no cars coming. Handbrake off, into gear, and drive around the roundabout. That kind of stuff, as opposed to slow down, nobody coming, carry on smoothly around. So I used to really enjoy doing that. And you come into the whole. How can you do a continuous descent down, leave the whole, come out? How can you, without putting speed brakes out of it, how can you slow down the airplane and everything, get everything popped out? That to me was quite rewarding. I mean, no, airline flying is probably it's a means to an end, as in pay off the mortgage type job, as opposed to an end in itself, i.e. let's have great fun, even if it is a bit dangerous, which is Air Force flying. So I miss the fun of the Air Force flying more than anything else. I miss the camaraderie of being on a squadron, a tight knit group, doing feeling focused and doing the same job. I mean, in an airline, you're always in the company of strangers, yeah, again, I was aware that when I moved on that I had moved on, that the time was right for me to finish and to do something different.
Mike, I have one more question for me, and then if I may, just a few questions from my Discord channel, which is a place where people can go and sort of
I'm quite happy to chat away about it, so I just feel a bit guilty about taking your time. I think a couple of hours already.
It's all good. We're at 2 hours, and almost 2 hours. It's
almost
good.
2 hours. Yeah.
It's a good thing, because I think if it wasn't working, we would probably have ended it much sooner. So, my question was going to be around, you mentioned your son, him going through the pipeline at the moment. What advice have you given him? And you're doing the UAS training, flying, you mentioned that earlier. So somebody listening to this who maybe wants to join the RAF, become a pilot or become aircrew, I guess you're not going to give advice to somebody who wants to join and become an engineer. So the flying trades, what advice would you give them?
My advice would be to go for it. It is a uniquely rewarding job in terms of feeling you're doing something useful and feeling you're doing something that is exhilarating and exciting. It is adequately rewarding in terms of remuneration. I mean, you don't do it because you want to become rich. You do it because you want to do a job with a purpose, and because you want to do a job that's exhilarating, fun, that's difficult and challenging, and it is difficult and challenging, which is why it is rewarding to, professionally rewarding. So, you do have to go with it. You have to be endlessly patient in today's Air Force in terms of being messed around. But I mean, that's always been the way. The military has always messed people around, and nothing changes really. Just the way they mess you around. And you will frequently, very frequently, doubt yourself. You will frequently, because things are, it is challenging, it is difficult, and you will frequently wonder if you'll measure up to it. It is one of those things that constantly challenges you, that constantly makes you question yourself, and more than anything else, going through flying training and even succeeding as a military pilot is perhaps what you need most is a faith in yourself, but also the thought that you're never going to give up. The fact that you won't let the bastards get you down, that you will get through, you will show them that you can do it, you will get the job done. And I think those are the two things really, that to believe in yourself that you can do it, and also to never ever give up. Are the two things. But yes, it's one of those sort of it's a hard, challenging journey, but that's not to say it isn't actually very, very enjoyable on a lot of occasions. There is stress, there's sadness, but there's an awful lot of exhilaration and happiness and thrills and satisfaction on the way.
Excellent. So Let me go to, so some of these you might have already answered in the 4 hours or so that we've been talking. So, so Ghost Dog asks, I don't know, because we haven't mentioned this, so I don't know if this was in when you were in, but how confident were you in the use of alarm, the anti-radiation missile? Was that in around when you were in?
Yeah, it had come in actually. It just come in just before the Gulf War. So just I was leaving Germany the first time to go to Germany. When I came back, the 9 Squadron and 31 Squadron, I think, were both equipped with alarm. They become supposedly specialist alarm squadrons. Yeah, the thing about alarm is that you fired it off and you didn't know what it was going to do or what it actually did because it decided itself. It's one of those autonomous things. It lurked until it saw a radar and decided whether it was going to attack it. Or if it did, then it went off and attacked it. So you would never know whether that missile had actually taken out a radar or not. So and I don't know what was to stop 2 alarms or 3 alarms all seeing the same radar and going, oh, I'll go for that. Yeah. And then there being none for the others. So I think we're reasonably confident in it. I think we're rather more confident in that than we had been in JP233, which was a sort of nightmare weapon. I think we were very confident in the weasels, the harm shooters, because that's what they did professionally all the time. And although 9 and 31 were supposedly specialist alarm squadrons, they didn't have the electronic warfare kit that the American weasels had, nor did they have the training, nor the practice. So, yes, we had a degree of in faith in it. And I guess if we were probably going to go, once the Cold War was over, we would be heading off to, as happened, to less less intensive operation, shall we say, then probably alarm would be good enough for government work, really. So I didn't really have strong feelings either way, but I suspect it probably would work.
Good.
So, I hoped it would.
So Megami asks, and I guess you're going to have to think of the twin sticker on this, but was there in the back seat? How are they trained to land the plane?
They're not. No, they're not at all, and they weren't expected to. And really, if the pilot was incapacitated, they'd pull a handle, and you both punch out. Some of the guys had done flying training, but really, unless you were used to flying the back of an aeroplane, I mean, if you've never landed a Tornado before, so the chance of you being able to do so from the back seat, having never flown one before, is actually do that successfully without killing you both would be pretty minimal, really. So they weren't at all. I mean, we followed the much like the US Navy, guy in the back, and in fact the USAF had come that way as well. Originally, the USAF had 2 stickers, but with it. But I think the Weasel ones were single stick in the front. I don't know what the other F4s were like, but no, we did. They weren't pilots, and they weren't expected to be either.
Did you ever fly in the back of the twin sticker?
I did. Did I fly in the back of the twin sticker? I don't think I did fly in the back of the Strike a couple of times, because I think there was some talk about me getting rear seat qualified for. I think as an air-to-air refueling instructor, I think, and also at one stage, I think they were looking at perhaps as an instrument ratings examiner, but I never did either of those things in the backseat. So I think I had a couple of rides playing with the kit, which just made me feel sick, and I wasn't desperately sad when nothing happened, nothing came of it.
Okay. So Phil D asks, I'd love to hear more about Tornado and electronic warfare. Wasn't there talk in the mid-thousands or noughties about turning old F3s into dedicated Wild Weasel aircraft?
There was, yeah. There was, because I think 11 Squadron ended up they discovered that they could carry alarm. And they also discovered that because the RHWR fit on a Tornado 3 was better than a GR1, because it was actually designed with a sort of an ability to sort of triangulate, that they could actually use that equipment to actually locate enemy missile batteries and things. And so the idea was this aeroplane could be used, and I think they did unofficially, call them the EF3. And so the thing, but again, according to the F3 crews, but their fighter pilots say, would you believe what they said anyway? It was very effective, and their feeling was that actually the aeroplane fit was so good in that role that actually it would have then challenged the GR4 at a time when money was getting tight.
Really?
So I think it was a case of saying, well, actually, do we keep one squadron of F3s on just for this role, and do we therefore ditch 2 squadrons of GR4s to pay for it, or do we just say, yeah, off you go, and then we'll hang the alarms on the GR4? And I think that the decision was made, I suspect, as all decisions are really, but by the accountants rather than by the actual tactical needs. And I suspect that it probably would have been a very good airplane actually. In fact, it'd been ideal really to have had that, to have a couple of radar missiles on board as well, to be able to sort of to go in as both a sweep and a sort of sweep both enemy aircraft and enemy ground threats. So yeah, it's a shame it didn't go anywhere really. But I think you're right. It was there. I think in the early noughties, and then got killed off.
What about standoff weapons though? Because he also asks about that. Phil asked about the shift in tactics from iron bombs or even JP233, which we've kind of touched on, and we talked about laser guided bombs. Were you around for any of the conversations about Storm Shadow or any? And Brimstone probably is much later, but was Storm Shadow being discussed when you were still?
I think it might have been a sort of discussed in the margins, but no, it wasn't anything that I ever had anything to do with or came close to. I mean, the only missile at the time was Sea Eagle, which again I was not involved in at all. But yeah, I think we'd have welcomed the concept of firing off. Instead of your JP233 having to fly an airplane over, better to take the airplane, point it in the right direction, make sure it's updated, and then send it off to do its own thing.
Yeah.
The missile system. So I'm very much in favour, and we'd all be very much in favour of that. If you can stand yourself off from, the target, so much the better. And I'm sure anybody, the guys, Adam and guys who flew the JP233 missions over Iraq would very much agree with that. So yeah, I mean, there's nothing nothing big or clever about overflying a target who are going to shoot at you, because why get yourself shot at if you don't need to? But again, the thing about an airplane like the Tornado is that it gives you almost infinite ability to fire the missile system in from where they're not expecting to come in. So that's why your air delivery system gives you that flexibility to take a weapon somewhere and where they're not expected to be fired from and fire it in. Yeah. So very, very much the way that we should go, I think.
So Clockwork Raider, he asked about red flag. So you have talked about that.
Yeah.
He also asked, how much on average were you flying a month? And do you know how well that compared to other NATO pilots?
Yeah, I can tell you exactly about 15 hours a month right through my career. Didn't matter what I did, it's 15 hours a month. And it didn't matter if that's 30-minute flight trips in the Hawk or 3-hour trips over, sort of high, low highs. The only exception to that was in the Gulf, where I think I flew 50 hours in 2 months. So that was rather more intensive, but that was due to regular flying, because we had all spare bits and for the airplanes, so they all kept flying, and the fact that we're flying those longer sorties. I mean, that's something that we haven't touched on at all is the inherent unreliability of the Tornado. I mean, it wasn't good at all, and it was no better, particularly after the Gulf War, when lots of money was saved by cutting on spares. I mean, some monkey decided that we didn't need that many RB199 engines. Well, engines lasted about 200 hours, but he said, oh well, engines last whatever it is, 500 hours. No, they don't. And so, well, we ended up. I can remember when my last tour, and this is one of the reasons why I was so pleased to get off the airplane in the end, and also when I was at Rheindahl working on a Tornado desk, that at Bruggen, with 4 squadrons, there was usually 1 squadron away at out in America, either Red Flag or Goose Bay. There was usually 1 squadron away in the Gulf, and possibly another one off to Detcham 1 or something. So you probably end up with 1.5 squadrons there total. But with theoretically, given that the squadrons would, so some airplanes have been out to, so I know each squadron gave up 2 airplanes out of the 15 it normally had to go to America for North American training, maybe 2 aircraft to go out to operations. So even so, with 48 aircraft on the wing, let's say even if we've given 8 on the way, there still should be 40 airplanes there. But you'd struggle. There'd possibly be 2 serviceable airplanes in the whole of that wing.
Really?
Yeah. And there were, at one stage, I remember one of the jobs that my mate, Benny, that I was showing the officer, was given, was to go to Bruggen and count up how many airplanes there had no engines. So there are about 20 airplanes there with no engines, because some monkey earlier decided they'd save money by not buying engines.
Did you have to keep that a secret? I mean, was that classified?
I'm not sure. It was, and again, one of the problems with that, you see, is that you end up with an airplane that's got one engine, and now you lose another airplane losing an engine. So, well, what do we do? Well, we'll take the engine out, the good engine out of that airplane, leave it with no engines. So now we've got that one. So then with the TFR's gone on this airplane. Well, that one airplane with no engines, we could take the TFR out of that. So you end up robbing these things. So we ended up with about sort of 10 Christmas trees, which is already all, but the workload for the ground crew has suddenly gone up to the roof now. So instead of getting TFR out of the box and fitting it, they've got to undo one. They've then got to sign all the paperwork having done that. They're going to take Gloucester, and then they've got to fit the thing. Yeah. And then later they're going to have to do another change over there whenever the spare one comes. So the ground crew, I mean, their work just went astronomically through the roof. The flying rate went astronomically through the floor. And so, that was, again, one of the great frustrations. And, sometimes people were flying, I've said an average of 15 hours a month. Well, that might be flying 50 hours in 2 months on operations, and then flying 5 hours a month for the rest of the year. Yeah. It was not satisfactory at all.
It's funny because that almost, well, it does. It has shades of the North Korean model. I mean, I know that North Korea does that. They buy, or they, have historically bought aircraft, and then when they break, they just shove them at the end of the airfield and use another one. And there's no real, so you get this base, and on paper they've got a capability because they've got a certain number of airplanes, but actually most of them don't work. I'm just amazed to hear that back in the 90s.
That's where we were there. Yeah,
it's crazy.
Because in fact, when I can remember at Chippenham, there's a guy called Henry de Coursier who went off to fly with the Chilean. He did an exchange with the Chilean Air Force flying Hunters, and that was one of the stories he said, was that every day the flight from Argentina used to come in. So every day the ground crew would be up at dawn to push all these Hunters out on the line. So there'd be a line of 50 Hunters. The fact that only 3 of them had engines was neither here nor there. But as long as the Argentinians saw all these things lined up, they went, oh dear, we best not come here. So it was a bit like that, really.
So he also asked, about, he said, what was the process of learning how to fly with a TFR, and how soiled were your pants after the first time doing a TFR night sortie?
Bizarrely, not very. We had great confidence in it. But yes, you started off, I mean, we did it in the simulator, so you knew how it all worked. And you started off, the thing the TFR could be engaged from 1,500 feet and then in steps downwards. So, and in fact, when we started doing it, I think we weren't allowed to fly at night below 1,500 feet. So you initially at 1,500 feet, was a bit of a non-event then, frankly. But then as you step down, I think the lowest we got to was, I think we did get down to 500 feet at night. So you could, and again, that was quite interesting. But yes, I mean, flying through the Highlands Islands, more than anything else, it gave me an incredible sense of confidence. Actually, I mean, it was quite exciting, and you watch this sort of this ridge marking down the coming closer and closer, and then the airplane would pull up, and then you could see how it was going on the e-scope, how it was manoeuvring over it, and I think more than anything else, I was just impressed at it, just looking at it, thinking, wow, this is fantastic. Here I am in this basically cruise missile hurtling along, watching it do its thing. It's really impressive. So no soiled pants, no, just really impressed with the machine at how good it was.
And final question then, Mike. This is from Sedler. So best QRA story, and what was the worst weather you were ever scrambled in?
Well, we were never scrambled in QRA. I mean, we would only have gone in the event of nuclear war being declared. So our QRA was spent watching videos and playing Risk. So I think I did win one of the Risk games once, so that was good.
Is that your best QRA story?
Yeah. Well, actually, the other one was what I've already mentioned about watching Witness. So in fact, the Witness story was that one of the now sadly much later killed was aware that all the young pilots were. He was an elder gentleman, shall we say. And he was aware that the young studs got hugely excited every time this Top Gun thing came on. So he arrived from Q one day. Said, "Oh guys, I've just been to pick up the videos from the Napier, whatever. Oh, right, what you got? Oh, yeah, there's something called Top Gun or something." I thought, "No, crap, I didn't bring it." I was going, "What? You did what?" And he said, "No, just kidding." And the other one was we were watching the Sound of Music, and I remember looking around as a little tear came to my eye. I looked around, and there's everybody else going, "Oh yeah, a bit of hay fever today," and as we were all slowly, privately sobbing as we watched the Sound of Music. So as we sat there with our nuclear armed airplanes, 50 yards away, waiting to go and set the world on fire. So yeah, we never got launched happily.
So whenever I say it's my last question, I can never really be trusted because I do have one more question, but it's a good one. So your books are really, really good. Where can people get hold of them? And if they wanted a signed copy, is there any way? Do you have a website? Or you just going to direct them to
an address
Amazon?
on it, but yeah, the Amazon's the place to go. But if you send me a personal message, I am on Twitter. There's a Michael Napier, so you can PM me that, and I'm on Facebook as well, so you can Michael Napier. I think Michael Napier author. I think on Twitter and just Michael Napier on Facebook. But yeah, if you send me a message, I mean, the thing I can't get the books, so the publisher won't get them to me any cheaper than you can get them from Amazon, and it means that I'd have to pay to post them to somebody. So either if they get them from Amazon, either if they want to pay the postage, send it to me and I'll sign it and send it back. Or the other thing I've done for quite a few people is I haven't got one to show you. I've done a little sort of book plate with a little sort of printed thing off and sign that and then put it through the post. And some people like that, so I'm more than happy to do that. But it's you can. The publisher is Pen and Sword, and I'm not quite sure how much they're flogging them off for these days. But that's getting them directly from the publisher. They're certainly there on Amazon, and you can get them if you want to be a real cheapskate. You can get them on Kindle as well on Amazon. But obviously, clearly, I'd prefer you bought the hardback copy. Yeah, that's where they are at the moment. So yeah, they're available, and I think people have said that they enjoyed it. So it's not just me trying to sort of blow my own trumpet.
They're good books.
I think it's, yeah.
Mike, it's been a real pleasure speaking to you. Thank you for your generosity, giving us your time, for speaking so frankly about the aeroplane. It's been great to learn about the Tornado and about your experience. And I'm sure that at some point in the future, there'll be a reason for us to ask if you'll come back on again.